Okay, this is primary stages.
Oh, where am I looking? To you?
To me, yes, yes.
Okay.
This is primary stages off-Broadway oral history project. Today we are talking to John Lee Beatty, and it is Thursday, October 12th, and we're at the primary stages offices. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this. Where did you grow up?
I am a California boy. I grew up in a small town in Southern California. My father was Dean of Students at Pomona College in Claremont, California. And I grew up on the college campus, literally on the college campus.
And you spent all of your formative years there?
On the college, yes, there. And yeah, except now, because I'm from an academic family, which will show up very soon, just like Jennifer von Meyerhauser, also a faculty brat. Yeah. Jennifer's parents and my parents met each other, and they became fast friends as well. But she grew up on the college campus at Yale. Because of the academic structure, my father had a sabbatical every 7 years. So I spent a year in Europe when I was 8 and turned 9 and went to school in England for 3 months. Had an English accent for the next year, I think. And then when I was in high school, I lived for 7 months in Bogota, Colombia. So there were some outside influences.
And did you in Palo Alto or Claremont?
I was born in Palo Alto. My father was at Stanford at the time, and then we moved when I was 1 to Claremont to Pomona College.
Did you see plays, or was there any?
I saw plays from my earliest life. In fact, I was working at Oregon Shakespeare Festival a couple of years ago doing Sweat, and my last day there, I went to the archives because there was a production of Merchant of Venice. I've seen it many times, but there was one I couldn't identify in my memory. And I went into their archives and found that I thought I'd seen Midsummer Night's Dream and All's Well That Ends Well, which I did at age 6, but I found the Merchant of Venice, which I must have seen at age 5.
Wow.
So, and it stuck. I mean, obviously I could remember it. It was funny to see the records of my reactions to the pictures of Midsummer Night's Dream, and especially All's Well That Ends Well. I said to the lady, this lady was quite good. Their second costume, not so good. But I was like a 6-year-old, go figure, right? Crazy.
Did you see plays at Stanford or?
No, at Pomona, yeah, because we lived a block and a half from the theater at Pomona on the campus. So I was taken to plays at a very early age and saw many of them, of Shaw and Shakespeare and you name it. We went to all the football games, and we went to all the plays and all of that, art exhibits, everything. So I had a very enriched childhood. I was honest, a cautionary tale. If you enrich your child too much, this is what you get. So watch out. Be very careful.
And how about San Francisco?
We went to San Francisco usually once a year. We just went through San Francisco. It was a treat on our way to Oregon or Washington or somewhere else on family vacations. We traveled a lot of traveling. And to this day, I'm a traveler. It's just something our family did. So we'd have a month of traveling usually.
You were in public schools?
I was. A very good public school. And there are 7 colleges in Claremont, California, so the schools, the parents do a very good job of making sure the schools are good. So yes, I went to all of it was public schools. Yeah, Claremont High School.
Were there theater programs in the public schools? Or?
Yeah, I was that odd child. My parents took me to see Peter Pan try out at the Philharmonic in L.A. with Mary Martin. It was the tryout of the musical. And I came home and I wanted to, this was in 1st grade, so I wanted to fly. Secondly, I wanted to fly on a wire. And thirdly, I wanted to design scenery, which is the oddest of the 3, I think. But something took, and I totally, it's very strange, but children are odd. I've taught children since and realized this about kids. I totally got it, totally understood set design. I got the whole idea. Little thing, but I got it. It was like, So I was designing scenery from then onwards. I designed Peter Pan mostly at first, and then in a couple of years, branched out to Hamlet and other things. Crazy. I was the only set designer in my 4th grade class, and I would design, direct, and write, and act. And then that was a sort of an English drawing room thing. And then I did a Christopher Columbus, I think, in 5th grade. And then I did the Fall of Pompeii in 6th grade. And then I started doing, I'd been in children's theater productions, and then I was a very shy child, but they sort of cast me as mutes and things like that. But I got into puppets, and I don't remember the order of all this exactly, but I was into puppets as well. And I built miniature theater. I built a miniature theater in the garage, and so I had many model sets that I built that went into a theater that I made a little fly system for and all that. And then I had a larger theater for, it was like an arts complex. But I had a large theater for humans, and then I had a medium size for marionettes, and it's inexplicable. I don't know how my parents, I don't know what they were thinking. They were hoping I'd become an architect, because I also, truthfully, was very interested in floor plans, and I would draw, one of my hobbies was drawing floor plans. And they would keep saying, oh, maybe he's going to be an architect, with hope in their hearts, but it turned out, and I was pretty good in art, painting as well, and drawing. So put it all together, you get a set designer. It was pretty sad. But,
and you were reading quite a bit too.
I was a reader. My father was teaching English literature and the continental novel, he called it. I knew, and with that family, for recreation, we would play authors. Do you know that card game? Well, each suit is, Longfellow, and then one's Hawthorne, and one is Dickens or something like that. And you play. So I'd memorized the names of all the novels before I even read them. Yeah, we sort of Pride and Prejudice. I think I was 11 or 12 when I first read that. It was. But my father was very much into reading, and it was sort of dragged himself up from a not very prosperous rural Tennessee childhood. So. He sounded like John Gielgud. He had fixed his accent, overly fixed it. And later when I was working with Cherry Jones on The Heiress, she was trying to do Mid-Atlantic for The Heiress, and I was talking to her in the dark because there was a light cue that was in the dark, and we were chatting away, and I said, something's really familiar. I said, where are you from? And she said, oh, I'm from Paris, Tennessee. And I said, well, is that near Milan, Tennessee? And she said, yes, well, it's 20 miles. And I was hearing the sound of another person from north central Tennessee trying to cover up their Tennessee accent. So I had trouble watching John Gielgud movies because he sounded so much, he was always correcting our speech, and then of course, if he saw you sitting around doing nothing, he said, can't you read something? So, and I did read. We all read. I mean, it was a fairly literate household. I also had a very intelligent mother. I think this is very shaping of my life, but my mother was the smartest person in the house, and very modest person, not ostentatious, but she just was. So, and she was very good with her hands. She was very, one of those people, not only intellectually, super bright, but also just like cooking. We were all taught sewing, all of us, my sister and I were taught sewing, carpentry, and knot tying, and it was just sort of a hands-on type of thing, which obviously pays off in many departments later.
How about later years of high school?
I was forced, that sounds funny. I was already doing scenery. I was fairly notorious for doing scenery already, but our drama teacher in high school wanted me to design costumes as well. He was into costumes far more than scenery, and he forced me to design costumes. And I did that, and I learned a lot about it. And of course, the sewing background, it wasn't terribly strange territory to me. So I, learned how to buy fabric and design clothes. I had a few books about costume history and stuff. And going to school in England also, I'd learned a lot about English history already, even in third grade. But it was great education. But English history, the history of the English country church, blah blah blah. I knew different kinds of Gothic architecture. I knew all that stuff already. So.
And the costume work that you were doing, was this heavy building costume?
Yeah, building as well. My mother would help me and some other people, and I would organize it, design the clothes, and get the fabrics, and help make them, and we all were pitching in. Yeah, and my mother and I would. This is so embarrassing. My mother and I would sometimes build the scenery we had a little shop in the back. And one of her friends got such a treat because we got the wrong hour, and she and I showed up in the station wagon with the scenery for the show, and the audience was already there, and my mother and I are carrying the scenery, and it's so sad. I was also got involved in puppets rather heavily, and actually, by a weird coincidence, both rod puppets and hand puppets and marionettes. And that sort of shy age, you sort of transfer yourself into the puppet. And I learned quite a bit about the puppet world. And by weirdest coincidence, this very famous puppeteer came to work in the Parks and Recreation Department in Claremont. His name was Harry Burnett, and he'd been a very famous Hollywood puppeteer with this whole sort of cadre of, which I later realized, the whole K cadre of puppet people from Hollywood. They had I'm trying to remember the name of it. Next door to the Pasadena Playhouse I can't remember the name. It was like the Trolley Car Theater or something. I can't remember the name, but they had old trolley car seats for the audience. Elsa Lancaster worked with them and stuff. So there was a classical puppet thing going on in my town, and I was a little afraid of them, but that was a strong influence. Then we went to South America for 7 months, and I did puppets there. I made puppets. I learned a lot about paper mache, and I would make the whole thing, costume, paint them, and everything, work them. And then I came back and would do sets and costumes for the shows in high school.
Huh. A lot of different influences there.
Yeah, I was doing posters too, because I could letter. So back in those days, before the computer, you had to find someone who could letter legibly. So I do the posters for the football team and the posters for the drama shows in the theater. So silk screening, mostly.
Did you have summer jobs during the summers?
Yeah, I worked one summer, two summers I worked for the Parks and Recreation teaching children's theater. I had kids between 6.5 and 11, I think, which was very interesting. And we do three children's shows a year.
Where you would direct as well as...
Yeah, direct and help design. And but I had this kids painting, and like I'd draw a big cartoon and they'd paint, here's a field of flowers, you do the flowers, stuff like that. And I was directing, and they would, we'd have the kids write the scripts themselves, so we would help them edit. And I know this sounds like perfect training, doesn't it?
It does.
So
yeah.
it was. Yeah.
How about choosing a college and deciding where you wanted to go after 12th grade?
Well, as I say, I came from an academic family, so it was laid in quite early that I was going to go to a good school. My father's greatest triumph in life was later when someone at a cocktail party asked him where his son and daughter were, and he said, "My son's in graduate school at Yale and my daughter's at graduate school at Harvard." He might as well have stopped right there. He'd gone to heaven. This was heaven. We went on a tour of colleges for my sister, who ended up going to what was that called, Radcliffe, Harvard. And she had looked at I'd gone tagged along when they looked at. She's 2 years older. She'd looked at Pembroke as well, which is part of obviously Brown now. So Brown was one of the possibilities. I applied to 4 schools, some of which weren't as academically challenging. I wasn't the greatest student. I'm pretty bright, but in my family I was the dumb one, but I wasn't that stupid, but you know. And I ended up oddly, because my father had been dean of students, I was somewhat hesitant about fraternities, because fraternities had been what meant my father got up at 3 in the morning and disappeared to deal with some problems. So I avoided universities with strong fraternity life,
Oh.
and I wanted co-ed. Just because I'd been in co-ed education, I guess I believed in it or something. So Brown turned out fit, and I got into all of them, I guess, but I ended up at Brown.
You did not enter though as a theater major?
Oh no, I wasn't a theater major. There was no theater program at Brown per se. There was one class for no credit on, I think, Thursday or Friday afternoon for acting mostly. No, I was an English lit major. Doesn't it show?
And how did that go?
I like English literature. You have to remember when this would be, though. This is from 66 to 70.
Uh-huh.
So this would be the great change would be happening. So Brown was a drinking school as I entered, and people were stoned as I left. So and we wore coats and ties to dinner the first year, and they were just glad if we wore anything the last year, you know. And we went from a woman in your room for 3 hours on Sunday afternoon if you signed up a week in advance and left the door open, to co-ed dorms. So it was the big change and the big curriculum change. Being a goody two-shoes and from an academic family, I went and took all my required courses in my first 2 years, at which point they changed it so you didn't have to take the required courses anymore, and I'd already taken them. So that was kind of ironic, and actually I'm so grateful because a lot of the courses I wouldn't have taken, and I learned a lot. I was reading some letters home, and I'd forgotten that I actually English lit, English history. I forgot that I had advanced placement in Spanish literature, which I can sort of bring back somewhat occasionally. And that must have been a leftover from living in South America or something. I don't know, but I Spanish literature. And I actually took a speech class as well, which I found to this day one of the best classes I ever took. There were a lot of football players in it thinking it was what we call the gut, but it turned out to be a very useful class for me. Then towards, so on my first year I wrote, it's embarrassing. I was a very innocent young man with a big cloud of red hair and blue eyes, and very innocent. But the first year I participated, everything was extracurricular in the theater, so I did acted a bit, and then I sort of hung out, and I thought doing scenery was a treat, but nobody else did. So as soon as they found out I was interested in scenery, I sort of got kicked into the scenery. And there was Leslie Allen Jones was the technical director, and he'd come from Winter Stock, and oddly a very gifted scenic artist of the old school powdered paint and glue and animal glue. And he was colorblind, which was odd, and I'd help him mix the colors. But he was a great painter because he had a really good sense of values. And very flat painter, but good. And he sort of adopted me. And then I did sets, costumes, acted, and did posters because I was a silkscreen poster artist at that time as well. And made masks for Ubu Roa. And to this day I have certain chemicals I can't be around anymore because we weren't very bright in the 60s, and would do all these projects in closed rooms with acetone fumes, and I can't be around acetone at all. Like if I see someone cleaning brass outside an apartment building a half block away, I can't go, or I have to hold my breath and run through. I can't be around acetone. And this was the 60s, so things were being torn up, and we did some sort of outre theater, and, I don't think it was Guillen's. What were they called?
happenings?
Happenings, you're right. I think we did a few happenings as well. But my last year, I started doing summer stock. And I started doing summer stock in 1969 at College Light Opera Company in Falmouth, Mass., which still exists today. I support them greatly for obvious reasons.
It's not the opera.
No, they did a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan and old musicals, so they alternated to Gilbert Sullivan. It used to be run by Oberlin, but I got there their first independent year. And I was hired to be designer TD for the summer, and I threw myself into it. I think I got $500 for the summer, which I now think is quite a bit of money. But it was 24 hours, and I mean 24 hours. I would stay up. When we did a show, I would stay up for 2.5 days straight, I think. I don't really remember. It was a blur, but I did a lot of shows.
It was a proscenium situation?
Yeah, proscenium, an old carriage house from a mansion. We all lived in the big... I loved it. All you had to do was do shows and do your laundry. That was it. Nothing else interfered. Because at Brown, my friends used to tease me because I did actually quite well academically at Brown, mostly because I would run home from some rehearsal or some silkscreen project and write my papers. I couldn't afford to be late with my papers because, I had a project to do. So I would turn everything in on time, which endeared me greatly to the professors. And I would just do it. I sort of tore through it. It was kind of a joke at graduation when I graduated cum laude. Some of the people were, because I had this sort of dizzy quality, and they were sort of perplexed that I had done so well. My last year, though, John Lucas, they hired a really kind of wonderful technical director, designer from Yale, and he came up and he took over, and we actually ended up with a tech program, and they started having real theater program at Brown, but only my last year. He came up and visited me in summer stock, and we became friends and friendly and friends, and I took his classes and did very well in them and blah, blah, blah. And I kept doing sets of I have a huge resume of things I did in college. Scenery, costumes, and I wrote, my freshman year, I wrote the school musical, and I directed things and all that.
What was the school musical?
I'm ashamed to say it was called Nell. It was about Nell Gwynn, and it was a musical about Nell Gwynn, mistress of Charles II.
You must have had something beyond extracurricular before that at Brown, if you had a scenic painter on.
Yeah, extracurricular only. They did shows. Yeah, they did a yearly.
But it wasn't a declared major.
Not a declared, and only one non-credit class. But they had Brown Brokers, which actually is a good question because it actually turned out the students produced. We were on the Brown Brokers, on the Sock and Buskin board and the Brown Brokers, which was the musical board. And we actually kind of ran the theater ourselves, which turned out we were producing really in a way, and it turned out that was a really good background. And I sort of pity people for two things. I pity people who didn't get that experience of having to produce your own shows as well as design, direct them, whatever you did, prop them. But also being forced to take academic majors rather than theater majors. To this day, I get in trouble because I don't really believe in theater majors per se. Because you don't, for my taste, as a designer, you don't really get the breadth of education. You always look at the requirements as a drag, and English literature and English history were not a drag, and they're very useful in design, as is everything I ever studied useful in design. It's really odd how much certain things pay off.
What was the play selection like at your first summer of summer stock in Falmouth?
It was it alternated Gilbert and Sullivan, literally alternated. One Gilbert and Sullivan followed by Brigadoon, and then another Iolanthe followed by, I don't remember the next one. It was like, what do we do? Trial by jury, Iolanthe, the Mikado, HMS Pinafore. We did Brigadoon, the Fledermaus, the Fantastics. I can't remember what else, yeah.
Mostly all musical and operetta.
All. You get very grateful to Gilbert and Sullivan. They seldom sit down, so there are not as many props in Gilbert and Sullivan, thank God. And there was no money. I think it was $30 a show. I don't know. I learned how to make scenery out of anything. So.
And then after Brown.
Although, actually, going back to Brown,
yeah.
There were three directors finally at Brown: John Amy, James Barnhill, and Don Wilmuth. They stayed there almost till recent years. They've been there. They were kind of the three flavors of directors. And one was an academic, interested in the history of the theater, and he'd do the more conservative productions that were sort of, museum productions, I would say. And then James Barnhill, I now realize, was sort of older, and he had been sort of in the whole Kazan, and he thought you needed to stir up your passions, and he'd bang a big drum to try to get some juice out of us, And then John Amy was into bread and puppet theater, and he would do the Beckett shows and shows, Alfred Jarry, and he was your sort of intellectual off Broadway type. So I got one of each flavor. To this day I sort of amused by it because that's kind of what you get now. Right? They still sort of fall into combo platters, but still sort of those three kinds. Very useful, and I didn't realize at the time, but your relationship, obviously as a designer, your relationship to a director is huge, and it's a very similar task. And the fact that I had directed myself and acted, but also been around those guys and had successful or unsuccessful relationships with them sort of was a bellwether of what's to come.
And what writers did you find yourself attracted to in those years?
Well, I was confused because I had grown up seeing road shows of musicals, and of course, seeing My Fair Lady or whatever. So I really thought I was attracted to musicals, and the sort of not flashiness, but the colorfulness of musicals, and I would do them. But oddly, plays would sneak in. And I didn't realize that I didn't even realize I was getting interested in plays. I didn't as much.
Did you, were you making any trips into New York at that time, or?
A couple, and of course, and sadly, I did see a few things, but, sort of more like a tourist. I don't remember exactly. I'm glad I saw. I know I saw the original production of Old Pincher.
Old Times for Betrayal, or?
No, they all come back to the house to visit the father.
The Homecoming?
Homecoming, yes. Homecoming, Killing of Sister George, Cabaret. Sorry to say, Mame, not with Angela Lansbury. And then I would go to Boston because it was so close, and I'd see tryouts in Boston. So I don't remember the order, but Apple Tree, Promises, Dear World, can't remember what other shows. So I'd go up to Boston, see tryouts, which was very educational, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. And was there any other theater life going on in Providence?
Yeah, there was. Yeah, absolutely. There was Trinity Square. Rap was just starting, really. Yeah. So I went down, and a friend of mine was reviewing for the paper, and I went to see a show with him, and then I kept going on my own. So I saw quite a few plays. In fact, I was working with Blythe Danner recently, and I saw her play the youngest of the three sisters. And, So Yeah, there's a lot. I got sort of caught up on the classics, like Streetcar and Three Sisters and whatever, Our Wilderness and St. Joan and quite a few.
And that was a different
Three
producing arrangement too, wasn't it, in terms of the house?
Yeah, they had two places at that time. They had the RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, was next door to Brown, and they had an auditorium that Trinity Square used,
Mm-hmm.
and then they had their own theater, which was a sort of a thrust old church that they had, which was quite an interesting space. And Eugene Lee, my second year, Eugene Lee became their designer, and I got to see a lot of his design work, which was very interesting. And I'd seen Lynn Pechtel's work the first year, and I later painted next to in the studios, but that was interesting too. He had much more conservative, old-fashioned style.
Were there film or television influences during this time?
Not really. I mean, we all trooped off to seeing Ingmar Bergman films back in the day. I mean, that was a hot period for film anyhow, late 60s. I mean, we went to see a movie at our film society like once a week. I just found that, I don't know, I wrote a review of Greta Garbo and Anna Christie, so I used to stay up late watching old movies on TV though as a child, and kept doing that late into the night watching old movies, because back then of course you had to wait till it came on. You didn't have a choice, so I would stay up late. So I'd seen a lot of MGM musicals and a lot of movies I'd seen, old movies, which had affected me. And of course, I hate to say it, but we grew up fairly near Disneyland, so I'd been to Disneyland quite often. In fact, Ming Cho Lee later said that I'd perhaps been to Disneyland once too often. Which, seriously speaking, I've noticed from teaching is a sort of important thing, because American children get Disney from a very early age, and our perception is very much changed by Disney and how you design and what you perceive a princess to look like, or colors even. I actually now sometimes I use animated Disney cartoons as a very good compendium of what a color scheme for a certain period is. Like Cinderella is a really good color palette for the early 50s, and Bambi for the late 40s, and you can actually use it as research, but unfortunately it's also polluted your mind hopelessly, so you're always having to deal with Disney when you do something involving castles and princesses, for sure. Oh, you know what I left out? I'm so sorry.
All right.
Speaking of castles and princesses, my mother read out loud to us, of course. And as we traveled, I already heard Little Women and Joe's Boys read out loud to me. But as we traveled through Europe for a year, she would pick a novel per country. So while we traveled through France, this would be post-war Europe in '56, Tale of Two Cities was being read out loud to us, and Tales of the Alhambra as we went through Spain. And so there would be all these rather good books being read out loud to us while we traveled. Big influence again,
Was she
Ivanhoe being read to us while you're in England, for God's sake. Yeah, I mean, wow.
Was she a good reader?
I don't know how she did it without throwing up in the car, quite frankly, because we were all crammed into a VW Bug, and and Europe did not have expressways back in '56, so I couldn't do it. But she did. She soldiered on. The biggest mistake was Sherlock Holmes in England. We stayed at, I don't know if you realize how depressed England was after the war, but we'd stay in these really kind of creepy hotels, and they shouldn't have read the Sherlock Holmes before I went to bed, because I kept thinking the speckled band that the Cobra was going to come down. They have these positive wires on the wall. I kept thinking the snake was going to come after me. But it was, God bless her for reading those things. Wow.
That's ambitious read out loud material.
Well, it was partly because we weren't in school. She was supposed to be schooling us to make up for missing third grade. Needless to say, I had the 2.5 to 3 months in English schools, but truth be told, I came back and I was ahead of everybody else by missing third grade. So, but I mean, Europe rhymed with syrup was all I knew going over, and coming back, I would bore you with the history of the Norman conquest. But I total 360 really.
Do you remember in the Europe you're seeing plays there?
Oh yeah. In fact, it's oddly, I'm doing a show at Lincoln Center right now, and part of it's stolen from the old Vic in 1957. But
Junk?
yeah, junk. Yeah. I have some steps coming up the front that are a direct lift from what the old Vic did in 1957. But yeah, we were taken to the opera in Paris, at the Paris Opera, and the Zarzuelas in Spain, and saw Falstaff at La Scala, and then when we were in Tivoli, saw obviously the pantomimes, and then in England where we lived, I saw Shakespeare at the Old Vic a number of times, and the York Mystery Plays, which I looked at my program recently and realized that Judi Dench must have been Eve or somebody. She was either Eve or Mary, someone famous. So yeah, I was seeing plays and being influenced by that as well.
And Colombia was mostly
Colombia. I actually no, actually in Colombia there was a Teatro Colón, and we went to plays there. I could sit through a play in Spanish, but I saw Taming of the Shrew, and actually Ralph Richardson came through, and I saw him play Bottom in Midsummer Night's Dream, which was a treat. And also, when you do Midsummer Night's Dream, it's really nice to know that someone can actually do Bottom and get the laughs off the text. He didn't do shtick, he got the laughs off the text. I still remember that performance. He was amazing. Yeah.
So going back to leaving Brown and the end of your Brown experience,
Yeah.
You had your senior year, you had the job at Falmouth.
Before my senior year, John Lucas, who was the technical director and designer, and he would then let me design and blah blah blah. He thought I should enter Yale, and this was the late 60s, so there's the Vietnam War to consider as well. But he wanted me to apply to Yale, and this seemed so unbelievable. It seemed too far to go to New Haven from Providence, so I sent my portfolio. It's not that far. I don't know why, but I never interviewed. I just sent the portfolio. And I didn't know what to do with myself, and he just told me I should do that, so I did, and I got in. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't, but that's what happened. And so he was more excited. I remember him running up and down the aisles of the theater. John got into Yale, John got into Yale, and I was like, yeah, but it didn't compute too much to me. And then I went and did summer stock again in Weston Playhouse in Vermont that summer. And
how was Weston?
Not as good. It was true summer stock, and I enjoyed it, but it was hard work, and no money, and staying up all night again. They had a mix of, you had to do a sex comedy, and then you did The Price, and then you did Anything Goes, and then you did whatever. Not quite as good a place as it should have been. John Lucas came up to see one of my shows, and he told me I'd better do better at Yale than that. And ouch. But, we're running towards the end of the season, running on films. But
they couldn't have given you a lot to work with.
No, I once got in trouble. The musical Finian's Rainbow, the budget was $35 for the scenery. I was called into the office because I spent $42, and I was chastised for being so extravagant. You could buy quite a bit of stuff for $42 back then, but still. I went back there recently and someone had written over the decrepit paint sink down in the basement. Someone said, "Did Joe Melziner really start like this?" So 20 years later I went and wrote under it, "No, but John Lee Beatty did." So whatever. I remember staying up all night and it's like 4:30 and 5 in the morning looking out the window, stirring paint or something, and seeing a cow getting up and going out to the meadow, and it's like the cow's staring at me like, "What the hell are you doing?" And I'm like, I agree, I don't get it either. So, it was a pretty place, good food. The food was so good that the actors complained that they were gaining weight and they wanted the food quality to go down, which didn't quite scan for the rest of
They
it.
fed you at least.
They did.
That's good.
Again, I like that about summer stock. You only had to do your laundry and do shows. That was all. That was all. So,
And this was 1 week stock.
1 week, yeah. It's actually, it's really, it's good preparation for life, for a designer's life. I learned a lot.
And how was Yale when you got there?
How was Yale? Well, as I told you before, so I got to Yale, and this is really important, and I stress this when I go and lecture at theater, at schools. Ming Cho Lee, I was the first full Ming Cho Lee class at Yale. Donald Lohenslager had finally retired and turned over to Ming, who had been teaching there part-time, and Ming became the head of it. And so I was the first full Ming product. We had to do, it was very lonely at first. I got there early and I didn't know anybody, so I literally did not speak to anybody for a week and a half. But, and Yale socially wasn't great that way. It was a pretty big change from college. They weren't terribly keen on you organizing your social life for you. So, so we had our first week of class, and Ming Cho Lee shows up, and we're given an assignment, and we go home and do it, and I'd come in with it, and it was the first time I'd had any competition. And there was like 7 of us, I think, in class, and I started...
All set designer?
Well, you had to do everything, and Ming, of course, being a set designer, emphasized that. But yeah, back in those days, you had to concentrate in 2. I ended up with scenery and costume, but there were lighting designers in the class, but everybody had to do designs. I mean, that didn't get you off the hook. But I never had competition. I was always the best set designer, certainly in my elementary school. I was also the only, but even at Brown, but all of a sudden there was other people around me, and that was an interesting event. And then Ming critiqued my first set design and didn't like certain parts of it. But I have to say, the next week I came back, I was twice as good a designer as I'd been the week before. The light bulb went on. I was like, oh. And it was the competition and Ming. And all of a sudden, I wasn't the only person talking about masking or, the meaning of the door and all this stuff. So all of a sudden, things took off very fast. Unfortunately, I guess I can talk about this, this is also 1970, so the Vietnam War and the draft, and I went down and got out of serving, which was sort of a shocker because I just started design school, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm doing this. Something turned out, I'm doing this, nothing's stopping me now. And also sort of tragic socially speaking. I was just watching that Vietnam War documentary. It did break. All the Yaleys would go to the physical, and all the Yaleys would just go right back to Yale, and all the townies, the Italian and Polish guys from town, just got on a bus and went to training. It was a sad time. Not good. But whatever. Anyhow, things just started happening for me at Yale. I think I was probably the best Yeah, Ming found out I'd been an English lit major and was a little hesitant. Like he let me in on my portfolio, but he was hesitant about my artistic skills. He was worried that I'd be more of an English lit major. But he came around, or I came around, I don't know. I turned out to be good at rendering. I now realize in retrospect I was a very good student, partly because I was been raised by teachers, but I was a very attentive student who listened, and I did all of my work. Again, it was a joke at Yale too that I always turned in all my work on time. So much so that my last year I took my spring break off and to do the final project and came to class with it done on the due date. And they decided since nobody had done all their work, they would just lop off the last project so everybody could graduate. But I'm sitting there with the sets, costumes, and lighting for Dr. Faustus and kind of feeling, that's not fair. But I did all my work. And I now realize I was a totally motivated student. I loved scenery, sorry.
Who was running the department when you were there?
William Warfel, who just died recently, the lighting designer, I think he was head of the, I don't know, he ran the sort of nuts and bolts part of it. Ming obviously was the leader. And Jeannie Button, Ariel Balloff first, and then Jeannie Button were my costume teachers. They were okay, not great. And William Warfel taught lighting, so I took lighting from him. Okay, not great. I think I might have done more lighting if I realized it wasn't about electrical loads, but it wasn't bad. I loved the theater history classes taught by, oh, he's famous, I'm sorry.
Gilman or?
It's a funny name. Sorry, famous theater historian. Alois Nagel. I loved those classes. I was really into theater history. And I read my way, as I said, I read my way through the theater history books at Yale, which paid off later, believe me. I ended up working with half the people. But also I took Stanley Kaufman film history, with film, which was great. But my favorite class, believe it or not, which I took my second year and then my third, was scene painting, taught by Arnold Abramson, who was the master scenic artist in New York, and he was co-owner of Nolan Studios in New York, which was painting big Broadway shows. And, but obviously Ming was the center of the educational experience.
And you already had a background in the painting.
Well, I've been painting scenery, yeah, since I was a kid.
And mixing paints.
And mixing paint, yeah. I'm good with my hands. I would sew costumes too. I would work in the costume shop at Yale as well. I'm good with my hands.
The head of the department was?
I guess it was Ming. It's a little bit. Oh, Brustein was. Yes, it was the Brustein period.
Drama.
Yeah, sure.
And was the rep getting started?
Yes,
then?
It was. Their productions weren't very good, but that turned out to be a good education too. As I sometimes we used to laugh was about learning what not to do when you get out, but also just trying to examine what went wrong.
Was there any crossover for the students?
Yeah, in my senior year, I designed sets and costumes for a show at the Rep. In Rep with a show designed by Ming, which was an interesting, because Ming was a professional. You had to make room for him. Wonderful.
And it was 3 years of grad school. Right?
Yeah. I went and did, one summer I didn't do summer stock, and then I went to Wayside Theater in Virginia for 2 summers of designing there in Middletown, Virginia.
And how was Wayside?
Great. It was wonderful summer stock, plays and musicals, Tartuffe and, Mr. Roberts and Tartuffe, and big Spoon River anthology. Small theater, but, nice mix of shows. learned a lot.
There were also
I also, in my class at Yale, I was the most, I was, I think, the only person who had built scenery before. And I'd had shows. There were some people in my class who'd never had a show on stage before. But I was way ahead of that. Way ahead of that. I would say, not to be rude, I was the standout in my class, but I just was, I think. Santo LaCosta was our teacher on Saturdays as well.
Oh.
And Santo, who I adore, but he was tough on me and sort of merciless, and I couldn't figure out why. And one of my students said, "John, you haven't figured it out?" And I said, "No, I really don't understand it." And he said, "Well," pointed to my work, and I didn't realize that I thought in all modesty, I didn't think I was any competition to Santo. I mean, it would be. But I guess he saw something that I hadn't woken up and seen yet. So.
Did the students build the scenery?
No, there were tech students, but I got deeply involved. They used to tease me because of my background. I liked working with technicians, so I got really involved in the building and the painting and the texturing and all that stuff. So, being the 70s, you textured everything. So,
were you doing or were you working in new plays at all at Yale then? Or?
We didn't really. That's a good question, and I regret it. I don't. And obviously, I was there with Albert Inurado and a lot of people. I regret that we didn't really design their new plays so much. We would be assigned projects, and what I didn't see, interestingly. I guess Sigourney was a class behind me, and I don't remember the order, and Meryl the class behind her. All these people, and you realize later, of course, like these people, they say, destined to become a star. Well, they were the best-looking people in the best drama school in the country. I mean, where else would you look for an actor? But the irony being that the young ingenues getting out of drama school were 25 when you got out, too old to be an ingenue, especially in Hollywood. That was leading ladies and leading men, but you're too old. So there's some very good people in school. So that was an interesting effect. I became very conscious of age and the speed at which you have to go in show business when you're young. You really have to make progress fast. Oh, what were you asking? I'm sorry.
Well, what happened at the end of Yale?
Oh, well, let's go back a little because Arnold Abramson taught scene painting on Saturday mornings at 8. A lot of people didn't show up for that class, but yours truly, being teacher's pet or something, I showed up every class, and sometimes I was the only student in the scene painting class, but I was full of questions, and I asked him about the painting on the national tour of the second national tour of My Fair Lady, and he looked at me, and I now realize he thought, "Oh my God, I've got a live one." But and then at the end of the year's classes, I shyly asked him. I said I enjoyed this class so much that I wondered if you were ever allowed to repeat it. In total innocence, I said this. I can't believe I was such an ingenue. And he said I was, and so I repeated the class the next year. I just loved. He was fascinating, a great painter, and I just learned so much about painting and designers, actually, and how he treated designers. I didn't realize at the time I was learning how the highest level of show business, how a painter might treat a designer in their work. He was both critical. I won't repeat what he said about one of my things. It haunts me to this day because, of course, there's one big flaw in my work that I will never acknowledge. But he caught it. But otherwise, very supportive. But he was no fool. I don't know. Well, let's see. Finishing Yale. I finished Yale. I had a big portfolio of sketches because you basically did a sketch a week in the beginning. So, and students say, oh, it's unrealistic. And I would say, actually, as the careers turn out, that was not unrealistic. Unfortunately, I disagreed with Ming there a little later. There was no training in the business of theater at all. And I learned later Ming didn't believe in it and didn't want people to. I learned the hard way. The management students asked me up later to speak to students about the business of being a designer. And Ming found out that had happened and was not amused. He didn't. And some design students snuck in and listened, and he didn't want them knowing the business of design. And I don't necessarily agree with him about that, but he thought, what I do agree with, he thought that the 3 years were your last chance to be, not to think about the business part and to experiment and develop in sort of, I don't want to say in a cocoon, but in an academic environment. He didn't really want you to. He didn't even tell us about the union exams, quite frankly. We had to find out on our own, which I find odd in retrospect, but that's the way he saw it. So, you kind of did things Ming's way, too. I mean, he's a great teacher, but it was more like entering, I would say it's more like entering that atelier of a Renaissance artist, like, while you were Ming. And if you went to Leonardo's studio, you did it like Leonardo, and until you got out of Leonardo's studio, you could become something else. But you did it sort of Ming's way, but Ming's way was a very good way. I had done sort of scenery that I'd seen so many touring companies of musicals. My scenery was sort of flat and decorative, and Ming's was more sculptural and sensible in the larger sense of the word sensible, and sensual in the sense of more senses being involved. So, and Shakespeare and all that. So that was a great influence, but he sort of did it his way.
And Joe Melziner.
Yeah, the guest lecturers were Joe Melziner, and again, I've been reading in the library. I'm a reader in the library. There were all these books that have been donated about history of the theater. I'm sure I'm the only person who read the biography of Josephine Hutchinson. I mean, really, it was just like very odd. Or Ina Claire, or any of these people. Years later, when I was working with Eva Le Gallienne, Miss Le Gallienne and I could sit down and have a frank rap about Jane Cowell and all these historic, Miss Barrymore quite a bit. I mean, a lot. I learned a lot about Miss Barrymore from her, but I'd already read about Miss Barrymore already. But and she called them Miss. You didn't call them by their name. You called her Miss Le Gallienne. But that paid off later. I'd read my way through the biographies, literally 20 feet of them. So I knew quite a bit about theater history. What were we talking about? Sorry.
Well, we were talking about Yale and the designers and the guest designers.
Yeah. So Joe Melziner and came to speak, and he was coming in and out a little bit, but he was interesting. He was quite the gentleman. I still wear white shirts to this day because of those guys. They always had fresh, if wrinkled, linen. Joe Melziner was interesting, but he was going in and out. He got confused and thought we had seen the wisteria trees with Helen Hayes. He couldn't even remember the name of the play. It was sort of Ghost of Christmas Future. I can't remember the names of my plays either, but or when I did them. But and then Jane Greenwood came and spoke, and I've become a collaborator since with Jane Greenwood and. Who else? Robert O'Hearn, I think, came, and Boris Aronson, who was fascinating.
Tell us about that.
Joseph Svoboda, who was European, the opposite of my design style. Boris Aronson was a real huge designer, and he had, sort of been a second-tier designer for a long time, and then became obviously the biggest star of the '70s as a designer. He was very amusing, determined, and very realistic about show business. Like, he knew the battles ahead and the battles fought and the battles won, and he was quite philosophical about certain things and very bright. One of my favorite things he said was about building. Someone said, well, why do you do sketch or model? Which is best? And he said, there's actually no answer. You do a model, everybody, you do this with the little kitchen table and the two little chairs and the pots and the pans and this little 8-foot in scale platform. And everyone, you've done it again, it's wonderful. And then you get on stage and he says, there's a table, 2 chairs, and some pots and pans. And then they say, what's this shit? He said, well, that's what you approved from the model. And he said, that's the problem with models. But I mean, there are problems with painting. He had trouble, as a renderer, he had trouble getting the scenery to sit on the floor. He couldn't paint it. He's a wonderful painter on his own, but he couldn't get the floor lie down. If you look at Fiddler or any of them, he can't get the floor to lie down when he renders. So he was frustrated by both. But he's, of course, obviously telling you the job of designer is how do you communicate your design ideas and how do you wrangle them into being. A lot of his stories are about wrangling. Svoboda was very visionary, and we were doing the effect of gamma rays and A Man in the Moon Marigolds, and his set was like an inside of an insect or something with one light bulb, I think. Mine was what the script had said. That did not go down well at all. I was shot down really fast. Interestingly, though, in retrospect, if you look at what I did later, that was the collision that I was headed for anyhow, in style, because I ended up doing much later a lot of plays at Circle Rep that were kind of in the style of a mainstream American. Marshall Mason used to call it lyric realism, but what you expect from a Tennessee Williams play, scenically, sort of the Miltziner legacy, sort of. So he wasn't far off, Mr. Svoboda. It wasn't pleasant, but he wasn't far off. And as I said, Mingdom didn't tell us about the union exams, but we found out amongst us someone, I don't remember, it was a classmate. So I was going off to summer stock, but I took the union exam as a scenic artist. My teacher, Arnold Abramson, even lent me some brushes to take the exam, and he critiqued what I was turning in. He gave me very good advice, which I helped people get into the union as painters myself. His greatest advice was just follow directions. He said, you'd be surprised how many people don't. Which is really good advice, believe it or not, in life. And I took the exam in scene design. So
in New York.
Yeah, in those days there was no. They've changed the rules now, but those days you did a home project, which you had 6 weeks, I think. You turned that in, and then you went in for painting. You went in and painted for 6 hours or 8 hours, I don't remember, and they handed you a postcard and you had to copy it in Cassine, I think, at that time. And you were graded on that and with your home project, and designed sort of the same thing. We did Dr. Faustus or something, and then came in. No, we did Gounod's Faust, the opera, and then we came in and they gave us Dr. Faustus to design.
Did they assign?
On site, so you had to do ground plan and rendering on site. This is before the days of models, sort of. So I'm the end of that sort of whole era. I still paint sketches of my scenery.
You don't do models?
I don't. My assistant does them for me. I do it. the way I learned. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but I do the ground plan, sketch, ground plan, sketch, ground plan, sketch, and then I do full rendering, ground plan. I draft the show myself, and then the assistant takes the drafting and builds a model from the drafting. So, but I was a good student. I do exactly the way I was taught.
And the parameters of the exam, they assigned you the play.
Yeah.
You took it home, and you had 6 weeks to
Ground
finish
plans
that.
and renderings and everything, yeah.
And then you came in, and on site they gave you
And a white model. I think we did a white model, white paper model, full color rendering of one scene and miniature sketches of the other scenes with Faust. I think Faust has 4 sets, I don't remember. And then on-site ground plan rendering of Dr. Faustus.
And did you pass the exam the first time?
Oh, yeah. I was too young and stupid not to. I didn't realize, like, I did. I work in this straight arrow way. It didn't occur to me to be, I guess I was scared, but I just did whatever I was told. I was a good student. I just did it. Yeah. So I went off to Summerstock. Then I went off to Summerstock. And in fact, I think I had to fly back from Summerstock to do one of the exams, but whatever. And then at the end of that Summerstock, I got in to do the union in both categories, but I didn't.
Both categories being
Scene painting and scene design, yeah. They no longer gave you full cards. It used to be a full card. You got all the categories. But lighting had gotten more complicated, and they just had split it all up. I wanted to go into regional theater. That was what was happening. In fact, Ming was a huge proponent of regional theater. And he and Bruce Dean both, Broadway, bad, regional theater, good. Broadway values bad, regional theater values good. To be contradicted in the future, but at the time that was it. I applied to a couple regional theaters. They weren't interested in me. At the time, you had to learn, I should have made my return address in New York City, because at the time they really wanted New York designers. But I didn't get into any, but I got into the union in both categories, so the only place to go was New York to get work. And I don't know where I had the balls to do it, but I didn't even really like New York when I visited. I mean, I loved going to the theater, but... and another thing about Yale education, and this really paid off, the New Haven, the Schubert was still doing tryouts. Mm-hmm. So I would trot my little ass down to the Schubert and do standing room for the tryouts of all these plays, and I would go to almost every single thing that came. So, in fact, ironically, years later, one night during the first preview of God's Favorite by Neil Simon, there were only 2 people in standing room, me and Neil, who I later worked in 5 or 6 Neil's plays, but there was just little me and Neil sweating bullets, by the way. It was interesting. Good education to see what a playwright looks like at the first preview of his play, especially someone who'd had hits before. It was worse. It wasn't better. He was worse. He was terrified that it wouldn't be a hit. And it wasn't quite, but, they would fix. But I saw a lot of stuff try out there, which was very important. And we did go down to New York. I saw Midsummer Night's Brooks' Midsummer Night's Dream, and Ming would take us to the opera and, things like that. So and I saw the first preview of Follies and Total Innocence. I mean,
how was that? Must
the first preview of Follies, that was kind of interesting, yeah. Wow. I saw one of the later performances, not so wow, when the audience didn't recognize anybody who entered the stage. The first night, everybody who entered the stage got applause, including Ethel Baramark Holt. By the last performance, one of the last performances I saw, no one even knew who Alexis Smith was. It was like a big shift.
Long Wharf was in getting started then?
Yeah, and I saw a couple things at Long Wharf. Not so much, oddly. A couple things there.
And you must have come to town with
I
some
was-
stock credits and some Yale rep credits.
Yeah. My Yale rep would have been Brecht's Ball, so it wasn't something that would have transferred. I later realized that I never complained about anything, but I probably should have been assigned a new play, would have been more gracious. But whatever. I came to town. Someone from Summerstock was driving up to New York and literally little pickup truck and brought my suitcases and camped on the floor of a friend's house from Yale.
Where did you first live?
76th Street between Columbus and Amsterdam in a one-room apartment. Slept on the floor the first few nights. Slept on my friend's floor first before I found the apartment. Used to have to get a roll of quarters and go to the drugstore to call the real estate people. It seems ancient now, but that's how it works. And fortuitously, as I was sleeping on the floor of his thing, one of my classmates, Enno Porsche, had taken a job assisting Douglas Schmidt, Broadway designer Douglas Schmidt. And Enno, you asked the right questions. Wow. I got an apartment that cost $195 a month, and he got one that cost $300 a month. And he couldn't afford to work for Doug Schmidt, even though he'd accepted the job. And I heard that he quit out before he even started, and my friend said, why don't you go over there and ask for the job? So I did, and he hired me. And
this was a painting job or an
no,
assistant
to him. So I showed him my portfolio, and we talked about Yale and whatever, and Maine, because Doug had worked for Maine as well. And he hired me on the spot. I started working.
Do you remember what the first shows were that you were...
I assisted on the last Bus and Truck of Greece, and I went out of town with him on Veronica's Room.
Ira
11. What else? Over Here, we did the musical the first year. We did that. Some opera, Return of Ulysses. Quite a few things. Studio work. I wasn't really good at drafting. We hadn't had a very good drafting program at Yale. And my model building wasn't great. I was cheerful, and I showed up on time. And I had a lot of other skills, like I was good at propping and painting. I do renderings and painter's elevations. And Doug and I are still great friends. He was a very nice man, and he was very patient with me. But now that I realize I was good company, which I realize now was an important part of. It was easy to be good company because he was a nice guy, but it was important to have someone support you. I mean, I was always supportive of him, and I took great pride in not being. I was never one of those people who said, "Oh, I would have designed it better or differently." That wasn't part of the job. I liked assisting. But when Doug ran out of money, Arnold Abramson would hire me to paint out in his paint studios. I wasn't the greatest scenic artist, but I was fast, and he liked fast. He didn't like people to sit down. We weren't allowed. If there was nothing happening, he would make you do something. It was, but scenic art. This is 1973. Scene painting paid $30 an hour, and overtime was double time, which even today, I would think $60 an hour is a good money. Even $30 an hour is very good money to me. So it was a heavily unionized. The Broadway theater scene was not. A lot of theaters were dark, and one reason was things had gotten a little out of control. But so the painting was lucrative and very interesting. I painted. On a lot of Broadway shows, and you'd paint and you'd go see the show on stage, which was interesting. I wasn't always allowed to paint on everybody's drops. I wasn't allowed to paint on Boris Aronson drops. Wasn't allowed to paint on a Oliver Smith drop. I painted some Raoul Penny Dubois drops. I
They
did.
didn't let you do underpainting?
I do a very good imitation. Well, he had a very good eye. You would assign painters according to their skill set. I was very good at folk art, and or I'd get red grooms. I could do a pretty good red grooms. I had certain skills.
What was Red Grooms doing then? I mean, what,
Santo was copying red grooms. He was doing Stop the World, I Want to Get Off, and he did it in the style of red grooms. Arnold was very clever. Sometimes if he wanted to get some scenery out the door, he would station me near the door, near the entry door, while the loading door was across the way. It was in an old roller skating rink out in Bed-Stuy, and we went in groups to work in the morning, and groups as we left. You would come in overnight, and the house had burned down next door. It was kind of scary, some of it back then. A lot of New York was pretty scary. I didn't realize when I came to New York, of course, we were in this huge recession, and I didn't even, I'm a kid, I didn't factor. It turned out to be a benefit in a way, because you could get an apartment on the Upper West Side for not much money, and, there was a lot of flexibility because nobody had much money. There wasn't much on Broadway, but not as much as there is today. It's just a very different world. So he would sometimes station me next to the front door of the building, painting away. And I said, "Why? I was painting over there." He said, "Well, paint over on this one for a while." I'm standing there, and Santo would come in, and he'd see me, and he'd come over to gossip with me. And I felt really bad because we weren't supposed to talk while we were working, or we were I liked that. You worked. When you worked, you really worked. But I later apologized. I came over to Arnold. I said, "I'm so sorry." But Santo just went on and on. He wanted to gossip, and I feel really bad because I knew I was supposed to be working. He said, "Oh, no, that's good." I was loading out his scenery onto the truck on the other side, so... Sorry. They would play a lot of games in the shop. It was roller derby out there. The world of Broadway shops was, especially before computers. There was some hardball being played. Boris Aronson would say, "I want this person to paint the tree, this one to paint the trunk, this one to do the windows," and they'd do that, and then they'd switch them when he wasn't there just to prove that he was wrong, and then they'd switch them back when he came to the door, and he'd say, "You see, I was right," and they'd say, "Oh, yes." But they wanted, there was a lot of hardball. The older painters sometimes were pretty tough with you, like they would haze you a little bit when you started painting. It was old-time scene painting. It was before there was no photography. I mean, no computers. We were painting scenery.
And how did they haze you?
Well, my first day, I was taught you were supposed to stand up. We use long sticks, and a lining is when you take a little brush and you have to draw a straight line that's perfectly 1/4, usually 1/4 inch thick. And they put me on a curved, it was the back seat of a car that had tufting, painted tufting, and I had to go up and over a curved surface like this, keeping the 1/4 inch line exactly the same length and width and straight at the same time, which is almost impossible. And I didn't know it was impossible. I was just trying, and everyone's watching me. And then before our pea screens, they used plain muslin, and you had to paint it with starch. And you put a tablespoon of white tempera in with it, because the starch, if it pooled, would put a little gray cast on it. And they said, "Well, this is a simple one. We just need to go out and cover this drop plain with starch." Well, that's the hardest thing in the world, because any brush stroke you do wrong shows up and immediately ruins the whole project. And I didn't know, but they would say like it was so simple. But of course, they knew how hard it was. They didn't want to do it. So I'm out there struggling away, and you eventually realize that. There were some great painters, and and again, we were still using a lot of powdered paint. It was before these big vats of boiling water and glue bubbling away, and the stuff we called bulcum, which was starch that had congealed to the consistency of bulcum, and dope, which is Dutch whiting and animal glue and water cooked up into this sort of gelatinous molding plaster. A lot of technically bright things with old materials.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. I loved it. Absolutely adored it.
And how long did you work at the...
Well, I was painting there. You know, the day was over because we were on a 6-hour day. I think they couldn't afford us. I wanted to stay later painting, and he said, well, you can't. I mean, this is the way the union contract is now. So I'd be free at 3:20, so I would go and I could do a show at night. Or Doug would call me back. It's not steady work, so I mean, if there's no projects in the studio, you don't paint scenery. I mean, the place closes down, or they only need 2 painters instead of 12. You know, so I wasn't in pecking order. I was not one of the top guys. And it was an unheated building during the winter. You're painting in gloves, you know. But I would, you know, Doug Schmidt's shows would dry up, or he couldn't pay me anymore, or he would get a show and I'd go assist him. And then oddly, the Brown connections, not the Yale connections, at first were a bit stronger. The woman named Susan Chase, who'd been a stage manager at Brown, was working in a small theater way east called Manhattan Theater Club, which was a room about 2 rooms, as big as this one room. And they had 4 telephones for 8 people, I think, and that was it. And I came over there because she'd gone to school with me, and she'd hired me once for some other stupid project or something, I don't know. Anyhow, she was working there, and she said that they should see me, and Lynn Meadow, who'd only been there a year at that time, I think, had gone to Yale but not graduated, and I'd met her briefly there, but she didn't remember me. I remember her, but she didn't remember me. And she looked at my portfolio, and they hired me to do a show that winter, December of '73.
And they called it Stage 73 then? Or
yeah, I guess so.
This was 73rd Street.
Yeah, because they actually had to rent out the main space, the larger space, they had to rent out. They couldn't even afford to produce in their own theater. They only got to do one, I don't remember, 1 or 2 shows a year in their actual theater. They had a smaller cabaret space, which they produced shows in. That's where my first show was, Maroof Taylor of Baghdad. It was during the Story Theater period, Kenneth Cavender. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't even afford to cover over the bowling lanes downstairs. It was an old social club with a bowling alley, and the shop was the bowling alley. Your scenery could be as long as a bowling lane, but no wider, because they couldn't afford to cover over them, so there'd be a trough on either side. So I designed this set of little, we're calling them handkerchief drops. They're little drops they're like this, and you pin them all together like a whole bunch of handkerchiefs. So I designed that because they fit on the bowling lanes. And then we got one day where we could paint on a larger floor in one of the rehearsal halls. And we did Maroof in their cabaret theater. And it's quite, I did the costumes, I sewed them on the floor of my, I can't believe this. I sewed them on the floor of my apartment. I guess I had a sewing machine, so I must have sewn them on the floor of the apartment. I don't know where else they could put them. Crazy.
And that's an awfully narrow stage.
With a big old, oh no, that wasn't the stage.
Was
Their cabaret wasn't narrow. It just had this column about this big around in the middle of it, which they never knew what to do. That's where Crimes of the Heart was there later. All sorts of successful plays were there. But it was a very awkward space. They always had shitty theaters.
That was the first floor, I think.
Yeah, yes. It was. Yeah. To your left was that theater,
right?
Which they later called either upstage or downstage, I don't remember. Then the main theater, which had been 73 or whatever you call it,
right?
Commercial, a semi-commercial space. And then they had a cabaret space later, Peregrine's Place or whatever it was called, on the right side. And then their offices were upstairs, and their bar was in the elevator, and it went up and down between the floors. And the shop was in the basement, and the dressing rooms in the shop were in the basement. And they had commercial productions in what was that group that Alan Albert ran? was in there a lot.
Phoenix or the Phoenix?
It was some
18
improvisational theater company. I can't even remember. And my first off-Broadway show was there. Someone asked, they rented the space and asked for a recommendation. And since I was an inexpensive young designer, I was hired to do this off-Broadway review called Some People, Some Other People, and What They Finally Do, which was my first off-Broadway credit rather than off-Broadway credit.
And the first off-Broadway credit was?
Maruf Taylor of Baghdad.
Baghdad. Uh-huh.
And then I did some more, now I don't remember what happened. Then I did something with Lynn, I think. I don't remember the order of it all. But when, we did a review. I don't remember. Something snowballed around that time. Something snowballed. And so I did this play, and it was a laughter because there was some people, some other people. It was one of those sort of dated, now I realize, witty reviews where people showed how talented they were. And they'd sort of gone out of style with Carol Burnett, but it was still sort of hanging. It was a flop, and it would have run one night, but it ran 3 because there was a newspaper strike and they couldn't get their bad reviews out to close it. So 3 days later, the bad reviews came out and they closed it. But that's how it worked. But that, oddly, led to me being, new boy in town that worked for cheap, led to working at Queen's Playhouse in the Park, which was in the old New York World's Fair Pavilion out in Flushing Meadow. And they hired me to be the designer for a season of basically summer stock in Flushing Meadow Park.
All right, we continue on. So we're at Queen's Playhouse in the Park, and it's about 74?
Yeah, 74.
Uh-huh.
And the first show is The Amorous Flea, a musical version of School for Wives, I believe. And then we did Room Service with Shelley Berman, then Come Back Little Sheba. And I call these shotgun weddings. I was just forced upon whoever was directing what. And the third shotgun wedding of that summer was Marshall Mason was doing, Marshall W. Mason was doing Come Back Little Sheba, and he had a Circle Repertory Company. And I didn't know much about them. I think I'd seen one play at their theater up on the west side, but I really didn't know much about them. But I'd read the article in the Times called, what was it called? Suddenly Real Plays About Real People, I think was the headline or something. And so in a fortuitous event, I met him and started talking about designing Come Back Little Sheba. It was a disaster because the leading lady got ill at the critics' performance and didn't go on, so the theater actually collapsed. But oddly, this last show, Marshall asked me to design a Circle Rep from that. His designer, David Potts, was going back to school. So Marshall liked what I did, and Dennis Parashy lit it. And he had been an old collaborator of Marshall's that Marshall hadn't been working with in a while either. So it was very interesting working with Marshall because he wanted her to be vacuuming on stage, and I said, "Oh, that's going to be so difficult because the speaker for the vacuum cleaner is going to have a second cord coming out of it if you want it to come out of the look like she's vacuuming. So we'll have to hide a second cord so that it sounds right." And he said, "No, we'll plug it in and she'll vacuum." And I said, "Well, but it's a fake electrical plug." And he says, "No, it's a real electrical plug. She plugs in the vacuum cleaner and vacuums the floor." And I said, "Oh, well, what about the breakfast scene where she's cooking the eggs?" And he says, "Well, she's going to cook the eggs." And I'm like, "Oh." And then I showed him a set, which he liked, but he didn't like the furniture placement. He said, "Why is the chair facing the audience?" And I said, well, so you can stage it better. He said, I'll take care of that, but, it should look like they really live there. And sure enough, I mean, when they did it, they just sat on the edge of the chair. You didn't notice it, but they never faced away from the audience unless he wanted them to. So, but I'm not stupid. I got it pretty fast, and he liked my design style, and it was a good mesh, because it's actually an inch play. It was kind of in what he later called American lyrical realism, or whatever he called lyric realism. But I didn't know what it was called, but it was a pretty good match. Sort of ended up with like an Edward Hopper painting. Sort of.
Do you remember the other people in the play or involved in it?
The woman who, movie star, High and the Mighty. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. And they had not done this. They had not done this at Circle Rap. This was just
no. And Marshall was an up and comer because of Circle Rap. Hot L Baltimore had just become a hit, and they were just showing up. So he was hired as an up and coming hot new director.
And had they made their transfer down to the Village by now?
No.
Or they're still on the?
So I was hired to do Battle of Angels, which is a Tennessee Williams predecessor to Orpheus Descending.
Right.
And I went up to their theater on the Upper West Side and measured it and designed it all with Marshall for there. And no sooner had I designed it than they lost the space. And we had to move down to the Village, to the, I guess you'd call it the garage, whatever that is.
Was their show running in the garage then? Was Hot L?
No, it was over at Circle in the Square.
I see, okay, all right.
It had started uptown and then gone to Circle in the Square. And they hadn't really, they'd had a designer, but I guess he, Hot L, but he hadn't shown up or something odd happened. And Marshall and Lanford did most of the scenery themselves. They told me. I always take that with a grain of salt, but possibly true. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize having Marshall being cut loose without a designer was a fortuitous event. I had no clue.
And the garage had been an established off-Broadway theater.
Yes, right. In fact, I think the first time I'd gone in there, they'd done Waiting for Godot there and some other plays. It was basically a black box, but the seats used to face east. I think they used to face east, and the stage was on the... No, the seats faced east, and the stage was on the east wall, I think, and then it changed when we got there. So we got Circle Rep, I say we, Circle Rep was them, but kind of annoying to have designed it for one space and then lose it. So we all ran down to the Village to 7th Avenue South. Very disturbing because it no longer was in my neighborhood, so it meant I had to take the subway.
You're still on 76.
Yeah, or I moved to 86 where I live now. I don't remember when in this process, but no, I was still in 76, absolutely. I remember one winter I didn't have enough money, so I had to borrow a penny because I had 69 cents and I needed 70 cents so I could go down because it was 35 cents each way on the subway. Doug Schmidt had a cash flow problem, and before ATMs you couldn't get money, and so I spent a Christmas with no money. I ate rice, and I mean, I knew money was coming. I wasn't that pathetic, but I had to borrow a penny so I could go somewhere in the subway. It's really sad, but it didn't bother me. I never was terribly interested in money, which turned out to be, of course, doing what I do, a godsend, because, look, I mean, I even got the job with Doug Schmidt because I didn't care about an expensive apartment. But, yeah, so we all ran down, and I mean the entire company of Circle Rep ran down. Judd Hirsch was peeling paint off the walls and painting the bathrooms. Everybody, Chetty, Farrell, and everybody in the company did it as a group, which was important. Circle Rep in the long run, who knew? But they knew, but I didn't. I caught on pretty fast. And so I did the first show there. We were so naive, wonderfully naive, but that was before off-Broadway theater companies. We had maybe 8 subscribers. We hardly knew what a subscriber was, and I kid you not, Marshall and Lanford Wilson would go throw an I Ching to find out when they should open the play. It wasn't to avoid the Jewish holidays or Times was going out of town. You threw an I Ching to find out what's the word? A good time to open, but propitious time to open. And we built the set, and then you just saw after the set was built, you saw how many seats you could fit in. Oh my God. I mean, this was not a recipe for commercial success, but it sure was fun. Huge cast, and not a cent. We built the sets ourselves. There was Earl Hughes and Bobby Ennis, and we would build the set and stay up all night. The actors, it was a fascinating process, though, and so central to Circle Rep's identity. You would build the set in the space for about 3 days, and then the actors would come on at night. You'd have to clean up, and the actors would come on at 6 or 7, and they'd rehearse till midnight. And then you'd come back and have the day to build the set again, and then they'd come in. And it meant that there was a very oddly organic experience, because the acting would be, Marshall was very much into the physical reality of the actor, and they would live in the set. I'm afraid some of them probably did live in the set. It was the off-Broadway days of... I knew someone lived in the dressing room for a while, and someone lived in the check office for a while, but... and the whole place reeked of marijuana a lot of times. God bless. But it became very organic, because the actors would be using the set. It wasn't, you didn't tape it out, and he wouldn't allow you ever to hold the script. A rehearsal, they never allowed scripts in rehearsal. They would be prompted for every single line, but he broke a play up into little beats, and you would memorize, say, just like 1 page or 2 pages, and you'd rehearse that all day. And then he'd do the next beat the next day, and you'd start reviewing and pasting them all together until you had an act. And he'd go on that way. There was great reverence for the rehearsal hall, great respect for the rehearsal hall. To this day, I won't enter a rehearsal hall in the middle of a scene. I don't go in and plop myself down and eat an egg salad sandwich. There was great respect for the rehearsal hall, and they held props from the get-go. Nobody held the script, so they always had something for the props, and the props would evolve as we went along. So, like, this cup might become the cup, or I'd find some wonderful cup I had, and but it would all be woven together, because they weren't ever holding scripts. So they touched everything. They touched the scenery. Then they'd be rehearsing with the scenery at night, and then eventually it all came into performance. But we were all sort of in it together. It was very unpretentious. I mean, it sounds pretentious, but it was actually the opposite. It was off-Broadway theater company, I guess, and nobody had much money or anything, but everybody appreciated what the other person did.
Did you have full-time access to the theater, or did you only
say
be
the
able
least.
to make...
My experience with doing all-nighters was very useful, yeah.
But it wasn't like you had a date that you could start moving the show in. You had the theater all the time.
No, we didn't. I don't remember how it worked, especially. But I know we had we would start on a Monday, and we'd have 3 days by ourselves getting the basic platforming, the columns and stuff, and then they would start showing up. And then, so you basically had a week and a half between the beginning and the end. It was full immersion.
And the actors would work in a rehearsal hall before they came to the...
Well, not necessarily at night. They would just be coming in from 7 to midnight or whenever. Right. I mean, they weren't equity even, I don't think. A lot of them were against equity. I remember, because we had a problem later when we moved uptown to some Broadway show. Tanya Berezin didn't want to become equity. They thought it was not corrupt, but they thought it wasn't cool. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking about the days of living in vans and having a dog named Free who wore a bandana around his neck. We're talking that period. Post-hippie, I mean, it was really just post-hippie, just barely post-hippie.
The first show in that space was Battle of Angels.
You should imagine also, of course, at this time I have a red afro. I had bright red hair, and I had this huge red afro. I mean, might help in bell bottoms.
The first was Battle of Angels.
Right, and then they asked me to do the next show, which was Lanford Wilson's Mound Builders.
Uh-huh.
And then they asked me to do the next show, which was, what was the next one? I don't even remember.
The Elephant in the House, or Knock Knock?
No, Knock Knock was the second year there. Oh, Harry Outside. Down by the rivers where the, Mound Builders, Down by the River where the water lilies are disfigured every day by Julie Bavasso, and then Harry Outside and Not to Worry. Yeah. And I got, it was fun. That space was great. The space was, we painted it black, and whatever proportion the stage was, the audience was the equal proportion. So you could, and important to their philosophy, the experience of the audience and the actor were sort of interchangeable. And you actually, most of the time, you walked through the set to enter the theater. So if it was the front door of the house, you often walked by it or through the front door of the house to get to your seat, which was totally illegal today, I'm sure. But it was sort of asked backwards, but a great, once you were in, you were kind of in, sort of like the rehearsal hall. You sort of, once you joined them, you didn't leave. It wasn't a walk-in, walk-out experience.
Why did you make the decision to flip the audience and the...
Well, no, it was classic black box. We were decide on the corner by the show what we felt was emotionally correct for the show, until finally there was something evolved called the hit position, which was the stage on the west wall, and then people started saying, can't we have it in the hit position, because they basically wanted another hit. But we went all around. We've been on every wall of that theater. Yeah, we would rearrange the seats.
I just remember walking across the stage.
Yeah, but that Battle of Angels, you walk through the front doors of the store, the shoe store, or the dry goods store, whatever it was, to your seat. But then Harry Outside, it was in the round, and you walked through some woods to get into it. And Not to Worry, you walked by the front door. Down by the river was all 360, I believe, or at least 180. It was 180. It was a huge L shape, different corners. No, it was.
And these playwrights were Lanford and Julie Bavasso and Corinne Jacker.
Yeah, sort of neo-Jacobian. Lanford, while we were doing Battle of Angels, there was a pinball machine on the set. It was kind of a fun set to live in, because there was if you know the play, there was sort of I can't remember what Tennessee Williams calls it, a something garden. But there was sort of fun areas besides the shoes, racks of shoes and stairs upstairs. And Lanford, because we were there all night, Lanford would come in maybe 1, 2 in the morning. Lanford would come in from the Lion's Head bar and hang out playing the pinball or just listening to us. I didn't realize, of course, Lanford listening to you means Lanford's listening to you, which means eventually something that you say or some inflection will show up later. But he sort of liked to hang and just see what was happening. And then we did Mound Builders, and I started to learn something about Marshall. So Lanford, who was actually very visually astute, he'd been a graphic artist and a very tasteful eye, Lanford. You had to be not careful. He was appreciative and not hard to work with at all. But he had his eye out for it. He was visual. And Marshall was a little bit colorblind, don't tell him. Oh, sorry, Marshall. But Marshall was more about the texture. Marshall was very into the feeling of the movies of the 50s. He'd been very affected by early 50s movies. And that's whole sort of Streetcar Named Desire, which is actually that kind of movie. Mm-hmm. And when he told me to design Mound Builders sort of non-realistically, I did. And then he said, well, when they opened the refrigerator, I said, what refrigerator? And then it was like, oh, it took me a while to realize when Marshall said non-realistic, he meant screen door, refrigerator, all the accoutrement of 50s tactile acting. He didn't mean like on a bare stage with no. So it was a little learning experience. Lanford hadn't finished writing the play, so we didn't know what happened in the second act. There was supposed to be a big flood, so I had all this detritus of the flood up on the walls of the theater, and then it turned out we weren't going to the flood, so I had to take down some of the detritus. But then to give the feeling of the silver screen, I, at the last minute, sprayed the whole set with silver paint to make it glimmer like old-time movies. I'd seen a Betty Davis movie at a Radio City Music Hall, which was amazing to see a black and white old movie, and the silver screen really is silver, and that was wow, that was interesting. So I put that on the set. Accidentally, Peter Schneider, who later went to Disney, was the stage manager, and he put his bag under the set and didn't know I was spraying, and I ruined his leather bag, which I feel bad about to this day. But yeah, so it ended up sort of looking like silver screen. Fascinating to be around all of us, but we were just like a family, and I thrive in a family situation. It later turned out I do well in companies because I'm kind of shy, and I do better where I feel people trust me rather than being out in the open. I know I've done a gazillion Broadway shows, but still it's true. And fascinating to watch, like Lanford. One day the actors complained that one of the characters didn't have enough backstory, so the next day the guy had Swedish ancestry, and his name was Gus or Augustus, and Gus. His name was Gus, and he had all this backstory. It was fascinating, and I said, "Why is he named Gus?" And Lanford said, "Oh, the only Swedish person I could think of was August Strindberg, so I called him August and Augie and then Gus." But it was sort of this amazing thing, and it's kind of brave of Lanford because sometimes he would write he had a critical eye, and he would write for the actors, and like Tanya Barrison, he absolutely adored her as an actress and her wonderful, wry, ironic voice she had. He hated the way she walked. So the character became crippled and had to lie down on a chaise, which I had to personally build for the whole play, almost the whole play, and only was allowed to walk in the last scene, thereby fixing, for Lanford, fixing that which he didn't like and emphasizing that which he did. She was stage center around the chaise, making bon mot in her inimitable, wonderful, gravelly voice style, and he was, but that's Lanford, that's what was happening. He would write for the voice of the company, and write for all of us, actually. Like, he was very observant about everything we all did, including scenery and lighting. Not as much costumes, but scenery and lighting. So.
And did that start making its way into the text?
Always.
Clues and
Always. Later, when you get to Tally's Folly, which would be 3 years later, he wrote it for us, and I mean us. I mean Trish Hawkins, Judd Hirsch, John Lee Beatty, Dennis Parrish, Marshall's Direct. He wrote it for us. And later when I won the Tony for it, I'm saying, why did you, he said, I thought you'd be good at it. He was right. He had seen something and he thought I'd be good at that, so he wrote it for us. It was fascinating. But he wasn't the whole thing. I mean, there was this marvelous acting company with lots of quirks. To this day, I see revivals of Lanford Wilson plays, and I wish someone had just recorded interviews with each of them just so you'd know what the impulse was, because he would match the vocal cadences to the actor. It was quite fascinating to watch. It was all very organic, he and Marshall got along, obviously, like a house of fire. Like, there was very little tension. I mean, there would always be blow-ups, I don't know anybody, but there was very little tension there was no, someone's going to get fired. It was more organic than that. It was like more family-like, I suppose. Ooh, sorry. Yes.
In 75 and 76, Yes, go ahead.
I have to say I was working at Manhattan Theater Club at the same time, so and still painting scenery, and so there was things working on both tracks, 3 tracks.
But mostly, aside from the scenic painting, mostly it was all off-Broadway at this point.
Yeah, and I started to do regional theater. I can't remember what year I started my first regional theater job in Seattle. So I found the old contract. We were paid $500 a show if we were lucky at Circle Rep. I mean, it wasn't lucrative.
Yeah.
I think it started at $220 or something. I don't even remember. It was not lucrative. But there was a whole different world, you know, where this was like, I'd go over to the East Village to buy old quilts, so ashamed, to cut up and make scenery out of. Or you'd go over, I'd go across Canal Street and see what was on sale that week, and before I designed the scenery, you know, make a set out of whatever was inexpensive, and go over to, there was a fabric store either on Orchard Street or there was one called Liberty that I went to a lot, and you'd find out some cheap fabric and you'd buy a ton of that and make the set out of that. Or this place called Odds over on the East Side. I knew all the sort of furniture dealers and go trek around. We couldn't afford transportation. I'd oftentimes carry the props back to the theater on my back, you know, but you go over to the East Side and sit down and have a joint with someone and, you know, paw through quilts, and you know, people could open a store. If you just said you were opening a store, you found a space, rented it, and opened it. It wasn't like permits were happening. Or
Yeah.
these gay guys opened some gay guys I knew, they opened a restaurant one weekend. They just decided it would be fun to open a restaurant. So they found this storefront, stapled designer sheets on the ceiling to hide the plaster crashing down, pulled their mother's recipes and opened a restaurant. I mean, with no permits. I can't believe people do these things. But it was sort of like that. It was like Circle Rep, in all seriousness, had a money problem and had a bake sale on the sidewalk in front of Circle at 7th Avenue South. In all seriousness, thinking that would fix the budget shortfall. Just, it's sweet, but it's like, wow, we really thought that? It's amazing.
But finding the objects or finding the fabrics before you designed the set must have been wonderfully creative.
Yeah, it was fun, and you know, we had these old doors and windows someone gave us, or we once, someone had a van, so we drove around the west side. We needed balusters and doors and shutters, I think. And we were driving around the west side. We'd pick up, you know, doors off the street or something that were being thrown out. And we found this guy who was trashing his mother's brownstone. This is so ludicrous, but it was in the low 70s. Think of what it would be worth today. But he was pulling out all the balusters and all that old-time molding he didn't like. And he just gave them to us. So we had this van full of these spindles were in... you know, they had a better resume than most actors. They'd been in at least 12, 15 shows. They got so ragged at the top and bottom that they kept coming shorter as we fitted them. Then finally someone pieced on some more wood and we went back. They ended up in Tally's Folly. They were in 5th of July, Tally's Folly. They were in everything. It was amazing. And these doors and windows that someone from someone else's show showed up in... You know, half the shows had them there, just turn them around and paint them a different color or add some trim, or I'd find something, or, you know, just crazy stuff like that. And vacuform, we'd go buy vacuform and staple it up to the walls. And eventually we changed the theater, so it was black brick, but some of it wasn't. And eventually I put fake black brick everywhere that you could screw into, and we built sets off of it. So it would sort of merge with the theater. The same thing sort of happened later up at Manhattan Theater Club. We'd have no money, and when I did Crimes of the Heart there later, it was a joke. I had a door from every designer other than me that had been working there. And then curses, it moved to Broadway, and I had to copy their doors, and I was so pissed off. Louis Santos' door, and Tony Strigas' door, and David Jenkins' door. But it was a very ragtag, but that sort of eclectic style was popular. A lot of lumber and carpentry.
In the 76, you had Knock Knock, The Elephant in the House. another Lanford Wilson play, which was Serenading
Louis.
and Rebel, and then Rebel Women at the Public.
Yes. Well, first of all, Knock Knock was by Jules Pfeiffer. That was a wonderful play and a wonderful design thing. The house did every trick known to man, and like the ceiling opened up and Joan of Arc levitated. All sorts of things like that. I mean, just cabinets falling over, and I was used to cooking and water by then, but all sorts of things. The set just did all these tricks, and it was a lot of fun. And that became a big hit. And that actually went to Broadway. How you could tell things were a big hit back then was someone, it was quite sanguine about it. If Jackie, Mrs. Onassis, came to see your play, it was a pretty good sign something was cooking. And sure enough, she came to Knock Knock. So that then you knew something's going to happen, and that moved to Broadway. And that was my first Broadway show in '76. It didn't fare very well and got all sorts of problems happen, but that finally did it. And once you've done one Broadway show, you're obviously qualified to do another. So I got 2 more right after that, but that sort of started it. It was unfortunate though, because Marshall eventually got fired and it was quite a mess. But what were the other shows there?
Well, there was Serenading Louis.
Yeah, which was on the South Wall. Not the best production, but okay. We did it again later.
And the Elephant in the House,
Which I barely remember, by Gorilla Kerr. I think, unfortunately, that was the play. I told him, I was going out of town, I said, you have a choice. I could read the second act, or I could design this, but I can't do both because I didn't like it very much. And I made a bad decision. They ended up having me design it, but my heart wasn't in it. I was going out of town. It was hard because I was starting to get hired a lot, and I needed to do the work financially, but schedules. Circle Rep was kind of casual. Didn't always fit in. It's hard.
And your first out of town was Seattle Rep?
Yeah, but I soon became popular. Seattle Rep, and then Indiana Rep, and then became very popular in Cincinnati. But my first, I think my first regional show, maybe, I don't remember where. In my first 2 years, I did Cat's Play The Tuck Family by Urkenyi at Arena Stage, Washington. And I was so excited to get to work at Arena Stage. Remember Main Cho Lee and all the regional theater values that had been inculcated in us. That was as exciting as getting my first Broadway show, was doing something at Arena Stage. That was like, oh, I've made it.
Huh.
Little did I realize, eventually things go wrong at all institutions. It doesn't really.
And you're in the round there.
Yeah, doing streetcar. No, we were in the other theater. What's it called? I'm sorry. In Proscenium, and then I did Streetcar Named Desire soon after that in the round with Marshall. Yeah.
Going back to Circle Rep in '76, Mrs. Murray's Farm.
Oh, that was kind of fun. Yeah, they baked the pie on stage from scratch. They made it and baked it on stage. That was in honor of 1776, I think. That was what's his name in London? Sorry, what was his name? He's no longer with us. Roy London wrote that. Well, not the greatest play, but it was fun to do. And that was done with a lot of old quilts cut up. I'm so sorry. Yes, indeed. Indeed. Yeah, Rebel Women. All of a sudden I was being noticed. And so 76, I ended up on Broadway with Knock Knock. And I was 27, I don't know. 27. Jack Hofstas was an assistant at the Public, and he wanted me to design this Rebel Women, which was kind of wonderful. Civil War drama, and quite impressive thing. So that was my first public. Oh no, I think public theater. Yeah, I guess it was my first public theater. Soon after that, I did Ashes. Yeah, that was my first public theater thing. Yeah.
And the farm?
The farm was that was at the Circle Rep by David Story. Yeah, and we didn't do a very good job. It was a Yorkshire farm.
Uh-huh.
It always ended up at Circle Rep, and it sort of ended up feeling like you're in the deep south, no matter what you did. But no, I'm being too cruel, but it wasn't the greatest production.
A tribute to Lily Lamont?
That was fun. It wasn't totally successful. I think that's where I met Doug Hughes, though, because his mother was starring, and I don't remember when. I'm working with Doug Hughes now on a play, and I always think it's funny. I met him when he was a schoolboy visiting his mom.
Helen Stenborg.
Helen Stenborg, who I was very fond of whom I was very fond. I met him in the lobby when he was visiting his mother. I remember he had his blazer in his book bag. Soon to go to Harvard, I think, after that. But he was still in, we laugh about it sometimes.
And Ashes was 77.
Yeah, Lynn, wonderful play, David Rudkin, one of my favorite things I've ever worked on. That was at Manhattan Theatre Club. They could afford the big space for that one, and that was a very collaborative and interesting experience. Excellent play, fascinating because it was written in a series of very small, fast scenes. In the first act, second act, longer scenes, and the last act, almost one scene or something. And the set was curtains, like hospital curtains that scooted across, and they would change behind them quickly, and so you could go scene to scene. And then that peeled off for the second act. There was a second row of curtains that did less, and you went from scene to scene. And then the third act, it was all stripped and was just the metal framework, which matched the play. It was a very good. I loved that play, and I learned a lot about acting on that play. It was Brian Murray and
Roberta
Maxwell. They were both superb. And that moved to the public. Joe had been important, though. He was involved with it. Joe Papp was involved with it, and Lynn admired him greatly. And we actually had to go down and show Joe what we were going to do for the design, and he didn't like it. He said it needed to be like Japanese, more kabuki or Japanese no theater design, and they shouldn't be on a bed. They should stand up against a piece of cardboard or something. And Lynn was kind of horrified, but knew we had to do something. And I said, well, take it with a grain of salt, but I get what he means. And he actually was instrumental in getting us to strip it down to what we did do. And Lynn, he would do favors for Lynn and for the Circle Rep sometime. I mean, for Manhattan Theatre Club sometimes. He didn't do favors for Circle Rep, oddly. That was in his period of... because, you forget in all of this that Lanford and Marshall were early invisible gay culture people, which wasn't so acceptable over in the beginning at the public. Joe came around later, but not in the beginning. But... so Ashes was quite successful. It was wonderful. And the thing I learned about the actors, it moved down to the Anspacher, at which point we had to do the whole set all over again, this time round, so we could get it into the thrust. Fascinating. But
wasn't that a little bit more difficult?
It was very difficult, but I loved it and we did it, so it worked out fine. We made a curved track. So the curtain, instead of doing this, it revealed this way and revealed this way, which became important later because that actually led to me getting another job from Richard Maltby. But he'd seen Ashes and loved that, and that's what led him to ask for me to design Ain't Misbehavin'. I don't know why.
Uh-huh.
But when I went away and I was working at Arena Stage, I came back and I was watching Brian and Roberta do the show, and I'd been away 2 months or something, and they were doing the play, and they were so wonderful, and I realized that for the first time, I realized just how creative acting could be. I hadn't seen it quite. The fact that they were still doing it later, and it was still so alive, and they were still calibrating. It was fascinating to me. That was really interesting to me. Really interesting. I was a big fan for that reason.
A Life in the Theater, Mammoth.
Wow. This is huge. Huge career thing. That has to kick back because of the acting company. Douglas Schmidt used to design for the acting company. They were looking for young designers to do acting company tours, and I was hired to do Arms and the Man, directed by Edward Payson Call, and that led me to go into Arena Stage because he was directing the show at Arena Stage. These are all connected, of course. But then I was asked by a young man named Gerald Gutierrez to design another show for the acting company, which was Duck Variations by this young playwright named David Mamet, or Mamet. We didn't know what you called him yet, but it was Mamet, it turned out. But Duck Variations and another play called, not Sylvia, Gloria.
Sexual Perversity.
No.
Oh.
This was before. This was with the acting company. And
sorry.
Jerry was doing it for the acting company. I did it with him. We did it up at Saratoga, and it toured. Then the off-Broadway one happened, and that's a whole different... I didn't even know those people at the Cherry Lane. I did go to see it eventually. But this started my relationship with Jerry Gutierrez, which went on till his death, obviously. But famously went on till his death. Well, not famous, I mean, whatever you say. What was the play we were asking? Oh, A Life in the Theater. So Jerry got the rights for A Life in the Theater. It was an off-Broadway commercial production at the Theater de Lys, Lucille Hotel. And that was like, and Pat Collins led it, and that was a gunshot. I'd never met Miss Collins before, and done a lot of things with her, and Jerry was fond of her, and we threw that thing together, and it was a big old hit. Back when you could have an off-Broadway hit. I mean, we're living through that period when still an off-Broadway success was possible.
Of a non-musical.
Of a non-musical. I played there for, I don't even know how long, more than a year.
Long time.
Long time.
Ulysses in Traction.
Albert Inarado, right.
Who you knew from Yale.
I knew a little bit from Yale. He was kind of standoffish at Yale, as we all were. I didn't have much to do with him at that time. I was just talking about this play with Andre Bishop the other day, because he died. Inarado just died recently. That was sort of about 70s rebellion at Temple University in the drama department, which the design was pretty good. It was not a bad play. Didn't feel like a circle rep play. The relationship with Inarado was complicated, and maybe Marshall Mason would be better to talk about it, because he had taken over Gemini, which had started elsewhere, and I guess at Playwrights, and went out to that Path Playhouse out in Long Island, and then came in, and Marshall messed with it, and it became a very long-running Broadway show, obviously. It wasn't really a Broadway show. It was at one of those half houses, which was the Little Theater, which is now the Helen. What is it now? The Second Stage Broadway.
Yes,
it became the Helen Hayes after the Helen Hayes was torn down. That wasn't...
The Water Engine.
Oh, I love that. The Water Engine, there was the Mamet connection, and Jerry Gutierrez was also... I had seen the Water Engine and forgotten it. I'd seen it at the St. Nicholas Theater Company in Chicago. Jerry was very keen on Chicago in those days, Jerry Gutierrez, And I don't remember, I was working, I guess, at the Goodman, and I went to see that, never dreaming I would design it. But when we did it at the public, Stephen Schachter directed, it was totally different, and it was done as a radio play, which they did there, but it was totally different. And we took the Martinson Hall and made it into a radio studio, sort of with Art Deco, Thomas Hart Benton type paintings, WPA paintings, and very interesting scenically, because eventually they got up from the table and parts of the room became the story, and they eventually played out the scenes, and then very much played out the scenes towards the end of it. Wonderful play. We revived that production in a way out at the Goodman later. I think I won some award for it later. I don't know. That led to Tommy Toon asking me to do Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, which I started designing, and that was off Broadway, and I pulled out of because there was a horrible snowstorm that year, which left me stranded in D.C. for half a week, and I couldn't finish. And then, oddly, I ended up getting Ain't Misbehavin' right after that, and I ended up with the hit musical of the year on Broadway. But it was all and Water Engine moved to Broadway. I'd been working in Cincinnati Playhouse, and they called me. They told me Water Engine was moving to Broadway, where it only lasted a couple of weeks.
Was it not with Mr. Happiness?
Yeah, it was a bad choice of It was a bad choice of show to put with it. Yeah, Charles, it was wonderful, but it sapped all the energy out of Water Engine, which was such a wonderful play. It was unfortunate. Nowadays we would have just done Water Engine, but back then you couldn't do a Broadway play that was 80 minutes, or that now you would just do it.
I remember seeing it on Broadway. It was a very handsome production, very sleekly.
Yeah, Art Deco.
Staged.
Yeah. We sort of did an installation on Broadway with these sort of Art Deco vacuum columns that went back to simulate the theater and covered the proscenium, sort of. But it just didn't last at all. Nobody went. It's just unfortunate.
Lulu at Circle Rep.
Ooh, not the best. I'm so sorry. I wanted to do a circus set. You know, a young designer's mistake. I always wanted to do a circus set. There's no reason to do it to Lulu, but I wanted to do a circus set. And there was a pretty good performance in the middle. Trish Hawkins was quite good as Lulu, and I'm sorry that I fucked it up. It wasn't unattractive, but I fucked it up.
Cat's Play.
Or Kenya. Lynn directed that. Helen Burns, very difficult woman, starred. It was quite funny. Then it moved to off-Broadway to the Promenade, where it died after a few weeks.
Going back for a second, you mentioned the Best Little House in Texas being off-Broadway. What was the venue?
It started down at what's that theater on 2nd Avenue where the APA Phoenix used to be.
On 2nd, the Intermediate or the...
Yeah, Intermediate.
Okay.
Well, it had another name before Intermediate.
Yeah, that was a big house.
Yeah, big house.
Yeah.
It was a mess. I mean, Marge Callaghan, she and I were friends, and I told her all about it. And I asked her what a mess. Oh, it was a disaster. I mean, she was in the back row designing other shows because they were weeks behind, and she had a drafting board trying to do something just to... Tommy Toon never forgave me, but I was young and stupid. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know. It was hard.
Duck Variations.
You know, I got thrown into all these things, partly because of Circle Rep and Manhattan Theater Club and all these things. I was a very young man. I wasn't yet 30 when all this was happening, and I was clueless a lot of times. I'd make these disastrous. I mean, why was I pulling out of a Tommy Toon musical? I don't know. I was just like, I don't know. You know, the sweetest thing, though, let's backing up, was that, I know you're trying to do off-Broadway, but I shouldn't.
It's all right.
My second Broadway show, second and third, one was The Bed Before Yesterday, and the second one was The Innocents, which was directed by Harold Pinter, and Lindsay Anderson directed the other play. And it was so sweet. Harold Pinter was a very nice man, and he saw my predicament as being boy designer. And I went to the interview and he wouldn't come down. And they said, you have to send your portfolio up without you. And I'm like, I've never done that. And they said, well, he doesn't want to be embarrassed he wants to see if he likes your work first before he sees you. He doesn't want to be embarrassed by your presence. And I'm like, but that's, this is before duplication. I mean, if you lost your portfolio, that was it. And he liked my portfolio, so he called me up to the hotel room, and Harold, who has this wonderful voice, talked to me, and he looked at me, and I think he was a little bit amused by my boyish behavior. And later he called me, John, this is Harold. Would you be so kind as to design my show? And I'm like, yes, Harold, okay. But it was very funny. He was a very nice man. He totally got that I was like in over my head. Not quite in over my head. I was just like a babe in the woods, And he totally got it, and he would protect me to try to get the best out of me. I mean, he was good that way.
And this was a revival of the Innocents?
Yeah, it didn't last long. With Claire Bloom.
On Broadway.
Absolutely beautiful. Yeah. I was so innocent, I didn't really compute. Of course, they were the two most famous English Jewish theater people, Claire Bloom and Harold. And I think it was very hard for them to stay apart. She was with Philip Roth, and he was with Lady Antonia at that point, but secretly with Lady Antonia.
Yeah.
There was a lot of magnetism going
on. Cat's Play.
Okay, yeah. It was a funny play. Helen misbehaved greatly, and it didn't do very well in the long run.
And Duck Variations, which we talked about, American Plays.
What?
It says American Plays.
Oh, that was just because the acting
Michael
company.
Kahn. Oh, they went.
Yeah.
Then you went on to 5th of July the first time around.
Yes, which was called Regarding the Bosom of Abraham. I still have the sketches. It was called Regarding the Bosom of Abraham when I started it.
Oh.
And I think Danny Irvine, Marshall's partner and who worked at Circle Rep as well, I think Danny came up with 5th of July, I'm not sure, but they changed the title after I'd started designing.
Danny an actor, or he was?
Director, and ran the intern program and things like that. You'd have to ask elsewhere how the title changed, but it was definitely Regarding the Bosom of Abraham.
Oh.
It was a very different set. Marshall and I had been burned. When we moved, this was very important at this time. As you can probably tell so far, things would be a hit off-Broadway or off-Broadway, and then move to Broadway, which was a new development because I had been doing the old Broadway, which I also was part of, would do these, you'd try out in Boston and New Haven and, do that whole route, Philadelphia, and then come in. That was starting not to work and starting to be even more expensive. Then these things like Knock Knock would show up. All of a sudden there'd be this oddly successful off-Broadway theater company play, like Playwrights Horizons was doing them too. And so they would get moved, and that's how I got to Broadway, obviously. But that was becoming a pattern, like you picked it off with Water Engine moving, and then all these plays eventually started having a life beyond wherever they started. Ashes even. Yeah. So
but with that production of 5th of July did not move, did it?
No. We ended up doing, oddly, Tally's Folly got to Broadway before 5th of July. 5th of July was done first, as I recall, then Tally's Folly off Broadway, right?
Yeah.
And then we went out to California to the Mark Taper, where I was also working a lot finally, and did them in repertory, which was very interesting.
Yeah.
And then Tally's Folly then went to Broadway, and then the following year after Tally's Folly was a hit, 5th of July went to Broadway. Very different production. Marshall and I had learned, though, from the first move, we thought we were all virtue coming from off Broadway going to Broadway. We'll show them, we'll do it as show them what we do off Broadway, and they'll now Broadway requires much more aggressive designing and more aggressive approach. And Marshall and I had learned together by being burnt on that first one that you can change completely and be true to the material. So when we moved 5th of July to Broadway, it looked totally different than
it did at the garage.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Tally's Folly was more of an amplification, but
When you say that you learned on the first one being what show?
Knock Knock, which
Oh,
he was,
Knock
he
Knock,
was like
I see.
oh from finally, and
I see.
we didn't have masking, we didn't have this and that, thinking it would give it the gritty downtown feeling. It didn't help the play.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the set was very well appreciated on Broadway, but it said, one of the unfortunate reviews said the set was having more fun than the audience. Ooh. But Jose Quintero took over. You know, Harry Rigby produced it. He didn't understand this off-Broadway thing and these dirty people. You know, we were all wearing jeans and stuff. He didn't quite get it. I mean, he was fond of me, but he didn't get it. And he wanted Debbie Reynolds and someone who was a big Broadway star to direct it. Jose Quintero, who I got to know that way, which was unfortunate, but then I ended up working with him quite a bit later. Who understood off-Broadway very well, because he became a star from actually Tennessee Williams off-Broadway, so he was actually Summer and Smoke, I think, famously, but yeah, strange experience.
The Woods.
A Misfire, another Mammoth show done at the Public. A couple things went wrong with that. Chris Sarandon and Christine Lottie were wonderful, but cast separately. Nobody stopped to think of casting them, seeing them standing side by side. But Christine, I grew up with tall women, but she was a tall drink of water and he wasn't. And it was very odd. And Ula Grosbard, he didn't want to do the obvious, and he was very sort of particular. And actually, it would have been better for us to have done the obvious on that play, which would be to do a House in the Woods. And it burnt us badly. It was all very arty, and we used old rope, beautiful old rope, to be the woods, and it was too artistic, self-consciously artistic for a David Mamet play. It really should have been more meat and potatoes. And too bad. They later did it much more successfully in Chicago with a shorter cast.
I think it came back with second stage or something.
Oh, really?
Too. Yeah.
Yeah. I've done a lot of David Mamet plays, oddly, but yeah. We've done the Circle Rep. We've done Reunion Dark Pony down there with Lindsay when Lindsay and David were still married. So I became quite friendly with them for a while, and I've gone to their house for, now it seems preposterous, a Christmas party given by David Mamet. Wouldn't happen today.
Tally's Folly, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
Which had started down.
Yeah, we had Circle Rep had run out of money. We had no money. We were always in a horrible financial situation. And I would say that, importantly, you know, I've learned Manhattan Theatre Club is still with us today and producing on Broadway and off-Broadway, et cetera, et cetera. But it's always sort of been a low hum. It's never had I mean, there have been some very good seasons, but it's never been skyrocket successful. Circle Rep was like skyrocket successful, and it changed theater and television. Like 30-something was Circle Rep on television. I mean, half the cast had worked at Circle Rep, and many of them came to work at Circle Rep after because they were so affected by it. But Circle Rep was always a shooting comment, and then Marshall would leave, and they never satisfactorily ran it financially. So we were always in trouble. There was no money, so we were doing a David Mamet children's show that had been commissioned as we had money to do a children's show. It was in secret repertory with Tally's Folly. I mean secret. Nobody ever said that they were in rep. The set flipped over in all different ways to hide the fact that Tally's Folly was there, and it changed to this children's show. And I was always called the secret rep, and we were just not supposed to mention it, but they used the money for the children's show to do Tally's Folly as well. And good thing they had, because when we went into repertory out in Los Angeles, the flipping platforms of Tally's Folly became very useful when we had to become 5th of July, because it already was designed in a way that it could flip around. But yeah, it was a really kind of a horrible situation. But we went on and it was a huge hit, so go figure.
Reunion.
That was David Mamet.
Uh-huh. The Jail Diary.
We had Albie Sachs at Manhattan Theatre Club. Yeah, Lynn, Manhattan Theatre Club did a lot of English plays, often with Brian Murray. And that was an English play with Brian Murray about South Africa and their problems.
Biography.
Oh, yeah.
A revival.
It was. Lynn, this goes to the heart of art. That's an S.N. Berman play designed for Ina Claire to have a stage door center entrance carrying a bouquet of roses, because the servants and the supporting cast in the first 2 minutes have established that she hasn't arrived yet and that she's down buying roses, so that the leading lady only enters. There's this big door, and the leading lady, 10 minutes into the play, after everyone's seated, of course, and everyone else has done the exposition, throws open the double doors holding a bouquet of roses. I explained to Lynn how clever that was, how beautifully constructed, and it was an interesting moment where Lynn said, "That's not fair." And I'm like, "What?" She said, "It's not fair to the other actors." I'm saying, "I don't think this is about being fair to the other actors. This play is..." But she never could grasp that. It sort of hurt the production. She didn't get like a star vehicle as a star. Piper Laurie was a charming star. She didn't get what you did with a vehicle. I got it, but she didn't. She didn't like it. It was very pretty. Pat Collins lit it. It looked great. But not suited. And she was never happy with the leading man, which is more of a symptom than it's a problem. It's not really, that's not the problem.
The Diviners.
Interesting. Circle Rep, I believe we started that in Saratoga. Circle Rep would go into residence in Saratoga. I think we started it there. Sort of slightly religious play. Arden Fingerhut lit it. Our collaboration, she's a famous off-Broadway lighting designer. Our collaboration was marred by the fact that we kind of had the same color sense, which you would think would be a good thing, but ended up being redundant. You couldn't see anybody because I would pick sepia and she would pick sepia, and between us, they were all sort of floating in sepia. And Jennifer Meyerhauser did the clothes, and we finally realized the only color that anyone could wear was ice blue, so that they could be seen. There's a lot of ice blue and sepia. Unfortunately. I mean, she was a perfectly nice woman and a good designer, just not the best. We shouldn't be put together. We were forced together once more, and we had exactly the same. 2 more times, we had exactly the same problems. Even though we were aware of our shortcomings, they repeated themselves. I said, I changed the colors to make it easier because of that thing. She said, "Oh no, I changed them too." And we changed them exactly the same colors again. It was like, not a good collaboration. Nice lady.
Crimes of the Heart.
Yes. Wow. Melvin Bernhardt, the director of that, was a friend of mine who recently died. We had a lunch together, and he told me he was dying, basically, and we had a long lunch, and we were talking about Crimes of the Heart, which was extraordinarily successful. We sort of, this really goes to the heart of designer directors and commercial success and whatever. Beth Henley never liked what he or I did to Crimes of the Heart. She thought it became sort of Southern Gothic twee. And I totally get it. Melvin told me to design it like a Eudora Welty story, which I did, which is exactly what she didn't like. She was never happy with it, even when it went to Broadway, won the Pulitzer and ran for 2.5 years or whatever. But we had a long discussion about that. She was doing The Wake of Jamie Foster very soon at that time that Jennifer Lamaros did the clothes for, and Ulu Grosbar directed and Santo designed, and Far Preferred, I believe, and that one failed, and Crimes of the Heart succeeded. And Melvin and I had a long talk about, well, what happens when you're doing... You can't help but notice that when you do what she didn't want, it became a huge success, you know? And it's an interesting dynamic of collaboration in the theater. I did a couple more of her plays, and then we parted company. Not unpleasantly, just did the
Miss Firecracker?
Miss Firecracker contest, yeah. And that moved. Again, that started in the same place, Manhattan Theater Club, in that little room, and I had to hide 2 sets in one. And they used to applaud after the scene change at the intermission, but that moved to the West Side Arts.
Upstairs.
Upstairs, yes.
Upstairs, yeah.
I did Penn and Teller downstairs, yeah.
And speaking of Penn and Teller, which would have been about this time, I read somewhere where you said that was one of the hardest.
It was very hard. I did 5 years with Penn and Teller. I did 2. I mean, they would go to Broadway or off Broadway, blah blah blah. West Side Art. Yeah, because it's all basically a tech rehearsal all day long, because the content is the tech, and their particular style, which I adored. I was a big fan. I can't even tell you, because you take an oath to when you start working with them. It eventually turned out I would ask them, please don't tell me anything I don't need to know, because once you knew what they were doing, it would become extremely tedious to watch. But if you didn't know what they were doing, it was fascinating. So it was done ad hoc, but they would literally straight face. They'd say, "Oh, let's stay till 3 and really knock this one out." And you're like, I mean, they weren't what's it, AGMA?
Yeah.
So there wasn't even equity rules. I mean, it was like first time I met them, they were worried who was going to pay the bill at Denny's. But I really liked them, and they were fun to work with. But it was just all physical work, and literally sweeping the stage, and then a piece of, I can't even tell you, something that looked like sloppy tech was actually central to something that they were doing. So at the end of the day, after all this hard work, it looked like you'd done jack shit. It's like, which was the charm of the show. It looked like they were just making it up on the spot, but it was hard. And then developing things. One of my favorites they never could do was, I didn't know that bees shit so much, but they wanted bees to fly to a piece of paper following pheromones to write out the answer to a question. And they had all these bees up in their Irvington, and trying to get the bees to do it, and they didn't, but they had all these bees flying around in a plastic tent inside a warehouse up there. And I used to look out the train window like a year later and still see the bee shit tracks on the blacktop outside, because bee shit, I didn't know they shat, but they shit everywhere. There's bee shit everywhere, and it didn't work. And then we had a goose once. I think it was a goose. That was a disaster. I mean, and then once we were playing with bear traps, which was really cool. They were wonderful looking. We got these wonderful old traps, and I was messing with them. And a lot of the Penn and Teller things were real, and I didn't compute, and I was working on them. And Teller, who actually in real life does all the talking, and mute in professional life, but it's the flip in real life. He said, "John, just don't move your hand right now." I said, "Why? What's wrong?" He said, "Just don't. He said, "Now slowly raise it up without shaking it." And I was like, "Okay, but what's the joke?" And he said, "Well, that's a real bear trap." I was going to cut off my hand. But it was like that. Like when they were hanging upside down over broken bottles, I was supposed to get, it was broken Coke bottles or something. It actually they were real. I mean, it wasn't, it was kind of amazing. It was kind of amazing what was real and wasn't real, and it's fascinating, taking an oath about secrecy. But the guy actually, the big hero for them and me and everybody, and the guy who set up all the routine, took him like 3 hours to, like, matinee day was hell because sometimes they couldn't start the evening show because it took so long to set up whatever he was doing in that secret tent backstage. I don't know what it was, but he was my hero.
Around this time, there was, which is 82, the Young Playwrights Festival, which was a beginning about that time.
Yeah, that didn't fit so well at Circle Rep,
Yeah,
right? It didn't fit so well. It was very ambitious, and it was in a hard period at Circle Rep, technically, and it was 2 evenings of plays, and Arthur Lawrence, who I got along with eventually later, came in, we were an organic family-style theater company who didn't say things like that to each other in public, which got me in trouble later because, I don't know, it moved to Playwrights Horizons eventually.
Angels Fall.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I'm a California boy. I loved it when Lanford wrote plays that took place in the West. But that took place in the Indian Mission in New Mexico. An Indian mission, not just a regular mission, an Indian mission in New Mexico. And I just loved designing the West because we traveled around so much when I was a kid in the West and loved it. It started down in, believe it or not, there was a time when Miami Beach was a failure and dying. And they started an arts festival down there, and we started it there to revive Miami like it needs it now. But it didn't. There were all these Art Deco buildings. They broke my heart. I thought, these are all falling into disrepair. No one will protect them. It will all be destroyed. But the reverse happened. But it started there, and then came to Circle Rep, and then went to Broadway eventually.
It was Fritz Weaver.
Fritz Weaver was
Barney
in it, and Barney.
Tanya.
Barney wasn't always in it. Tanya, Brian Tarantino. Who else was in it?
Not Richard Seff.
Richard Seff was in it in place of Barney Hughes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, interesting. I like that play. Well, not totally successful. Inside of an Indian mission, I love designing that. I did the most horrible, wonderful thing to the lighting designer, which was I put a total roof over it. And the only place he could hide lights back in the day, there were no LEDs, were what we call Inkies, which are tiny little Fresnels about this big. And he had rows, like 140 Inkies hidden behind, because I only gave him a rough-hewn beam that he could hide behind. But it was supposed to be inside of a church, and a mission church, and oddly that diffuse little lighting looked very much like the light inside a church, and it was quite wonderful. Wonderful. Dennis Parrish, a wonderful lighting design. He would say no, but he actually thrived. He looked best when you gave him obstructions. I learned a lot about collaboration with different designers, and I could give him a lot of obstructions, and he would always look good. Tally's Folly was all obstructions. It looked fabulous. It's like, put shutters in front of it and leaves here and
What I did last summer.
Oh, Pete Gurney play. I had done some Pete Gurney before that. That was an unfortunate mess at Circle Rep, and they replaced the director with my friend David Traynor came in, I believe. Getting the style right on a Pete Gurney play is hard, and not totally successful. Didn't seem quite right to be at Circle Rep either. We found there were certain plays that just didn't seem quite right at Circle Rep. They had done Richard Corey, was it? Another of his plays there, more successfully, I believe. It was one of Pete's plays. He writes so many plays. I've done a number of them. It was, one of his semi-autobiographical ones. Crazy Mary later sort of seemed like a variation on it. But it's, sensitive young man and all that. They cast a Jewish guy as the lead. And, Pete Gurney is writing about wasps.
Yeah.
didn't quite sit right. Wonderful actor, but I kept saying, I don't think that's going to work. But the guy was good, but he didn't quite get my particular group's self-effacing, whatever it is we do, passive aggression.
And then you did the Middle Ages, which was also Gurney.
I did it twice. I did it up...
Church of Heavenly Rest.
What?
That's East and 90th
Oh,
Street.
St. Peter's.
St. Peter's, yes.
Yeah. Did it there as a commercial production. David Traynor directed. I'd done it before up at that theater, the Hartman up in Stamford, that Melvin Bernhardt had directed it.
The Seagull at Circle
Disaster. Big disaster. We did it first, directed by Ellie Renfield. We did it first up at Saratoga, and it was supposed to go to Circle Rep, and the set was very contained, and it was a big curtain that went around, which made sense if it was contained at Circle Rep. Unfortunately, they decided at the last minute to move it to American Place, at which point it was floating in a big open area. The set didn't make any sense anymore. And it didn't show Circle Rep or me or any part of Circle Rep off to our best advantage. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when the American Place, the drainage line from the Indian restaurant upstairs burst and spewed 10 years of accumulated cooking grease all over the theater, somebody made the mistake of saving the set and costumes and props, when indeed it would have been better to have not opened and taken the insurance on it. And they had to evacuate the theater for 3 days and get one of those, companies to put 3 drops of something that smells like orange something. It was awful, disgusting. The show was a flop, and unfortunately, double disaster. Remember that I said that Richard Maltby had loved my set for Ashes. He'd loved the curtain that went around. The next show I did was this musical Baby, which he wanted me to use the curtain going around. Well, I'd already just used it for Circle Rep, but it was against the wall. But no longer was it against the wall at American Place. It was now floating in space like it did in Baby on Broadway, which was in a few months of it. And oh boy, was that a design disaster for me.
Huh.
Sorry.
And then other places back at Manhattan Theater Club? Other
Nice.
places?
By whom?
Oh, no. And that was the same time as Miss Firecracker Contest at
That's a good sign that I can't remember.
NBC.
Other places. Look how many shows I've done. Wow. Other places. I'm going to have to cut this out.
Oh, that's all right. After the Fall, Playhouse 91.
Yeah, After the Fall. That was a revival of After the Fall. Joey Tillinger directing Arthur Miller's play, Frank Langella and Diane Wiest. Semi-successful. Joey Tillinger was a big part of, I did a lot of shows with John Tillinger, Joey. I've done Lips Together, Teeth Apart, the Terrence McNally play with him, a lot of things at Manhattan Theater Club, some Joe Wharton revivals, Lute and What the Butler Saw. He kind of lost his nerve a little bit halfway through that. It got a little less interesting than it was going to be, I think. Wasn't a perfect production. It was a commercial production. I don't remember if it made money or not. It was at that theater that I don't even, it's in the high 90s on the east side.
Yeah.
I don't think this exists anymore.
I don't think so. They were selling it a few years ago, and I think they were reopening the theater with that show After the Fall. I can't
Possibly. It didn't have a way to get.
Term was
It
up
didn't
in-
have a way to get from the backstage through the auditorium to the front, and we had to build a corridor as part of the set, a corridor that led the actors to the backstage, because otherwise they'd have to come in and be trapped for the whole. It's the oddest thing. It was like a dead end. It was very odd. Very odd. You know what was odd? Manhattan Theater Club, in its history, we finally moved out. Sometime in this period, we moved out of the 73rd Street location to City Center, to a basement, another basement. When we were moving in, that would have backed actually onto a commercial off-Broadway theater on 74th Street.
Yes.
And it turned out, of course, they had been connected years ago. It had been the auditorium for the social hall. So we could have had that theater all along, and something went wrong with negotiation. But then on moving day, I'm at Manhattan Theater Club. I go upstairs. There had been a guy who took photos of linoleum for magazines. That sounds. A magazine was a printed thing that had. A photographer was. Oh, whatever. And he would build fake sets and have linoleum displays. I worked for Armstrong once. Resilient flooring displays. You call it resilient flooring. It turned out, if you go there now, it's restored. There was a European little miniature court theater upstairs. The entire time we were in these shitty rooms with burlap stapled to the walls, there was a real theater upstairs the entire time we were there. I was just like, you're kidding. It's like a bad joke. You go up there now, I've been there for events, and it's like, hurts. It really hurts. It hurts. There was a real theater there the entire time.
What were they doing with it?
They used it as a studio to build these sets for linoleums, the resilient flooring.
And I think that commercial space on the other side was where the Phoenix was.
Really?
Years earlier.
Really?
Yeah.
I know I assisted Doug Schmidt when I came to New York in the 73, maybe 4. I assisted him on a play that was there. It was a commercial off-Broadway, back when you could have commercial off-Broadway productions.
Yeah. In celebration.
Good story. Lindsay Anderson directing again. Lindsay was a tough guy, curiously conservative on stage. Everybody sees his movies and thinks, wow, wild guy. But on stage, he had like very old-fashioned taste, sometimes to the good, sometimes not to the good. Not Malcolm McDowell was in it. Not totally successful production. I think that opened Manhattan. Was that the first or second show at Manhattan Theater Club City Center? They moved to City Center, to the basement of City Center. Yes. And that was when the stage and the ceiling was much lower before they did a renovation, and the ceiling was very low and they had no money.
So that was 84. Yeah,
and they were very poor. And I made compromises on the scenery. I probably shouldn't have, to be a good citizen.
Tally and Sons.
Yeah, which was actually a tale told. The third after Tally's Folly, 5th of July, was a tale told, which we did down at Circle Rep. Not totally successful, although I quite liked it. So he rewrote it, Lanford rewrote it, and became Tally and Son, which we did. I don't know how much improved it actually was, but I guess they thought it was better. It didn't go anywhere especially.
Tomorrow's Monday?
Was done in repertory with the same ground plan. And that was by the same guy who wrote Mornings at 7, Paul Osborne. And it was curious. It was another Midwestern, I think Richard Thomas was in it, I think. Another Midwestern play. It was sort of interesting to see two Midwestern plays. And in repertory in this slightly same set, sort of. I mean, it had some modular pieces that changed, but nice.
It's only a play.
So this was Terrence McNally's coming back to life from his earlier times, and some of his buddies were in it, Jimmy Coco and stuff. And we had, again, Manhattan Theater Club always was short of money. The set, we couldn't afford the vacuum form to make the French molding. It was really Adela Holzer's fancy mansion that it took place in. Adela Holzer had produced some of his plays on Broadway, and she was. I went to her house for a meeting for a Broadway show, and she had a Bruegel over the sofa, but she wanted to borrow your credit card. You know, she was that kind of lady. So I sort of knew what it was supposed to look like. And it was in the early '80s.
Where was her house?
On the East Side.
Oh.
I mean, now they do the revival. You barely understand that, of course, this person would have to be on the East Side, but a lot of the sociological things have changed.
Yeah.
But it was an East Side, and at the time, her bedroom was painted peach, which was the color everybody had. So you had forest green, or you had peach, or you had terracotta. And this was peche, they called it. So we couldn't afford anything, so we bought one piece of French molding in vacuform, and these wonderful people, technical people at Manhattan Theatre Club, they've all gone into the movies because they were so good at it, but they hand poured plaster into the back of the vacuform to make enough copies for us to pin to the wall to make it look rich, even though there was no money. And it was amazing that we pulled it off. It looked quite good. It looked very good. But we did it later. We revived it out a couple of years later. We revived it out in Hollywood for the Mark Taper when they were at the Huntington Hartford, whatever it's called now. And the peach had aged. It wasn't in style anymore, and the whole thing just sort of deflated. Even though Charles Nelson Riley, who was a friend of mine at the time, was in it, but it didn't quite float anymore.
The Mound Builders and Caligula.
But I should say, let's back up one more. The set for It's Only a Play, we had no money, so the next play was Loot by Joe Orton, and we recycled that set and painted it over and made it into an English interior.
Uh-huh.
And then it moved to Broadway, and everybody's looking at the back. They took the scenery, and you're like looking at, why is this? It was so inexplicable, but I'd been recycling all this stuff to...
You brought the plaster?
Well, we put extra molding on it, and sort of the French molding became English molding. We made it very dreary. But there was all these sort of leftover bits and pieces that didn't make any sense. I mean, whatever.
And Loot had started at City Center.
Yes, it was right after it, obviously.
With Kevin Bacon, I believe.
Kevin Bacon, and later replaced on Broadway by Alec Baldwin. But and it had Wanamaker, who was wonderful, and Joe Mahar, who...
Zeljico?
Jelko Vanek.
Zelko, yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's very good.
The triplex was the Mound Builders and Caligula.
Yeah, this was down at that college down in Lower Manhattan. This was Circle Rep was failing basically, and we tried to return to doing repertory of things. It didn't work out very well. It was sort of, we were on a downward trajectory.
Principa Scriptoria, which is...
So Manhattan Theatre Club. I was doing a lot of stuff at Manhattan Theatre Club. That was Lynn Meadow directing a play about Byron and Shelley.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Let's go back a little bit to '82 with Living Dolls.
Living Dolls was wonderful. It was a musical by Scott Whitman and, Mark Shaman, of course, and directed by Richard Maltby. That was done at Manhattan Theatre Club. Absolutely charming. Should be revived. It took place, it was a Barbie doll musical. Barbie dolls were acting out of basically a Gidget goes Hawaiian. Thank you. You were laughing. I'm laughing. I bought tickets for 9 of my friends. I thought it was hilarious. It was delightful. But the audience at Manhattan Theatre Club was too old to have gone to a Gidget movie, let alone played with a Barbie doll. So it sort of bombed, but it was absolutely delightful. And they just didn't quite have the balls to move it. Nobody knew who Scott Whitman and all were back then, and that Mark Shaman were at the time, but that was like, it was too bad. It all took place in a Barbie doll case. We built a huge Barbie doll case with a clasp, and unclasped it and opened it up, and it was the Barbie's Hawaiian Adventure, and you took foam rubber surfboards out of the pockets in the doors, and it was divine.
It was a large cast show, or
About 8, I think. There was G.I. Joe and, all the characters you expect. There's a horrible copyright problem, obviously, because they called them other names. They didn't call them Barbie, but, it was very close. They were afraid. They were afraid people didn't get it, but I think that was mostly the theater club had a big learning curve about how to produce. They would make these naive, rookie mistakes, like the critics' performances having their regular audience instead of people who would actually like the show. And the audience didn't understand it, but it was like, when it was filled with people my age, they were roaring. They just adored it, and people would come to see it again. But they sort of killed it. I mean, Manhattan Theater Club really had a lot to learn about producing. I mean, they've learned by now, but they were slow on the outtake. Sometimes a little frustrating for me because by then I'd done a lot of Broadway shows, and I knew a little bit about producing and thinking, this isn't, let's get real here. But it took them a while.
Principa.
Scriptore. Principa Scriptore was a Richard Nelson play about atrocities and revolutions in South America, I think. Lynn was getting very conservative. It was supposed to take place in a pouring rain, and she couldn't stand the sound of rain, so by the end it was just a drip. But whatever.
But you were in the basement of
yeah, still in the basement, yeah.
City Center.
Yeah.
I saw some very good shows down there.
Some very good shows. They were under budgeted. I became very close with the technical crew, and very important. They had a wonderful technical crew. We sort of liked Circle Rep. In fact, some of them had started at Circle Rep. A very great collaborative technical experience on very little money, but we do some sort of miraculous work. And during this time, the quality of scenery was going up greatly, and I think both Santo and I were sort of at the beginning of that, and not to pat us on the back, but Off-Broadway was starting, these off-Broadway theater companies were starting to become similar to what Broadway was when I started.
Yes.
Technically, the technical level, and Circle Rep had a lot to do with this technical level increasing greatly, and even in the time I was there, we got better and better. They were huge leaders in sound reproduction and having 3 tracks going at once, and the sophistication of sound effects in theater. Circle and Chuck London and the whole crew doing that. That was a huge advance. Someone once asked me what was the greatest technological advance that made your scenery better, and I said sound, because hearing, crickets and a distant dog barking and the train going by all at the same time creates such a visual impact when you hear it. The Circle Rep was so good at it, and then like Manhattan Theater Club, the technical expertise of the crews was becoming very similar to Broadway, how Broadway had been, and they were starting. We didn't realize it, but they were starting to meet actually. And already some of the MTC sets were getting quote laundered and going to Broadway, which basically means they would take the set to a Broadway shop and repaint the back of it and do a little fluffing and put a stamp on it and move it to Broadway, which used to be theoretically legal, but now everyone does it.
The Early Girl.
The Early Girl. Oh, Demi Moore was in The Early Girl, believe me or not. Caroline Kava wrote it. Not successful, about a whorehouse. Not a successful play. They fired the lead. I looked at, they didn't fire Demi Moore, and I looked at her face and I thought, oh no, you're not the sort who gets fired. I see that in you. Okay. She was very young, but I could see a very determined lady. That's never going to happen to me. I could see that on her face. Interesting. Caroline Kava. who I rather like, the playwright. She came onto the set for the first time, and I do a lot of new plays, and it's hard. Sometimes the authors don't feel comfortable about the scenery. Caroline Cobb, it was amusing in retrospect, but she came on the set, she looked around the set, and she came over to me with the sweetest look on her face and said, "I just want you to know how much I love your other scenery." And I'm like, "Other scenery? That means, oh." Funny.
The Hands of Its Enemy, Manhattan Theater Club.
Oh, yeah. Mark Meadow. The play after Children of Alyssa God. I think that's all I'll say.
Bloody Poetry.
That was about Shelley and Keats. I think some of the people went on to become stars and directed. She wasn't totally happy.
Burn This.
Oh, a wonderful play, Lanford Wilson. That eventually went to Broadway. We first did it at the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles, and then it briefly went off Broadway to the theater in Michael Bennett's rehearsal hall building. There was briefly a theater in there, and we had to do it there just for a couple weeks. We did it also at the Steppenwolf because it had Steppenwolf stars in it, and then it went to Broadway. Lanford had always imagined it. This was interesting. The group was getting older and more sophisticated. Lanford told Marshall that he felt he always wanted it Broadway scale, and it wouldn't fit Manhattan Theater Club. It wouldn't fit, I'm so sorry. It wouldn't fit Circle Rep's space in that scale, and he wanted it bigger. And so we started Mark Taper Forum, and then it went to Broadway. So it was always conceived on that scale. It's become a very popular play. It's very hard to imagine this, but I hadn't seen a play that took place in a loft. And now, of course, every play takes place in a loft. But back then, it was news to take place in a loft, and it was fascinating. Lanford and Marshall and I also had a wonderful meeting once in Los Angeles. The play was on the monitor in the stage manager's office, and Marshall and Lanford and I sat out the play and watched it on the monitor backstage. And we were going to move it to Broadway, and we actually drew with like a grease pencil or something, I guess, on the screen of the TV monitor what we thought we should do when we moved to Broadway. It was fun.
Wow.
It was interesting. Marshall was extremely talented technically. He's one of those people who said, I think they, without malice, we would say, I think they built the step wrong. It seems like a half inch higher than what you told me. And you'd go over and he'd be right. He could look at a ground plan and block a show and he'd know. I don't know. He was curious. Of all the directors I've worked with, and I've worked with some famous and fabulous, but technically he just naturally had the gift. And during that John Malkovich, there was a scene. I probably shouldn't say this, but anyhow, Laura Crow designed the costumes. There was one costume none of us liked. So that we decided amongst us that scene would take place in darkness so that we wouldn't have to look at the other costumes were sensational. There was one on gorgeous black velvet payment, Joan Allen. She just looked stunning. But this last one was not a success. And so we decided that the scene would take place in darkness. This is a long play. It's a 3-hour play at least, if not longer. And so the scene took place almost in almost complete darkness. And John Malkovich says to Marshall, he says, I don't think they can see my face in here, And Marshall says, God bless him, says to John Malkovich, it wasn't always easy, by the way. He said, we've been here for 3 hours. We know what your face looks like by now. It's very funny. Actually that play was written for Al Pacino. And if you listen to that play, you can hear the cadence. Lanford listened wrote it for Al Pacino's voice, and you can just hear it. Malkovich was a little off for it, but I mean, he was good, but he was a little off. Just interesting.
The Lucky Spot.
Lucky Spot, Beth Henley, right? Don't tell me. That wasn't terribly successful. I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I think that was the last Beth Henley did. The Lucky Spot. It took. I think we made a mistake. I made a mistake. We all made a mistake. It became a little candy coated looking, and it was sort of what horrified her, a little twee. But the play was gotten a little twee by that point. I don't know what went wrong. Her husband directed it. It just didn't. It wasn't unpleasant, but it just didn't. Something wasn't cooking right.
Only You. Circle Rep 87.
So sorry.
Only You. Circle Rep.
Right, that was Tim Mason, who later did How the Grinch Stole Christmas with him. Ron Lagomarsino directed. I was talking to this play to Andre Bishop. What it was, and speaking about off-Broadway theater companies, it was like a Playwrights Horizon. It should have been at Playwrights Horizon, and it was at Circle Rep, and it was like, I tried to design it as if it was at Playwrights Horizons because it was that kind of, it was an urban, kind of charming urban comedy. That's not what we did at Circle Rep, and it never sat well in there. And I remember Mel Gussow reviewing it, and he was quite disappointed in it. And I didn't think it was quite fair. It was just in the wrong theater company. And I tried to, I painted the set all white and tried to make it very clever and stuff, which I noticed they did at Playwrights Horizons a lot. But people really wanted Circle Rep to be much more, down south than that. We used to say a lot of the Circle Rep plays, there was always a porch swing and some crickets, and didn't sit well at Circle Rep.
Woman in Mind.
Yeah, that was Lynn Meadow was on her English kick again. The Manhattan Theatre Club did a lot of English imports, and this was Alan Ayckbourn and Stockard Channing, who was wonderful, playing a woman in menopause long before she would have ever been in menopause. But Lynn said, "Oh, she'll age up a couple years." I said, "No, women age up 40 years to get awards, but they don't age up 4 or 5 years to." Nobody wants to age up for look that much. No, I know. But she was wonderful. Lynn got sick on that and missed the whole tech rehearsal, almost all the tech rehearsal. And Pat Collins and I kind of ran the show. Ann Roth did the close, I believe. And Alan Ayckbourn doesn't completely translate to American audiences. There was some very good acting, but some of it doesn't quite translate. I did a lot of Alan Ayckbourn. Lynn became very fond of his work and did a lot of his plays.
The Road to Mecca. Promenade.
Yeah, Ethel Fugard, directing, acting, writing. It's very awkward to, when you're designing, you often have meetings with directors to discuss what's positive and negative about a piece of work. Of course, you couldn't do that with Ethel. And you also couldn't talk to him a half hour before he went on because he was an actor. So there was a lot of awkwardness working with him. And Susan Helferty was involved with him at the time, and she was doing the costumes, which was awkward. I disagreed. I was the third designer. I had been done at Yale Rep and somewhere else. He did something that is very difficult for designs. First of all, she turns around and looks at the set and says, this is the best of me. She's an artist, and the set was supposed to be her art. And she also did these sculptures that were famous, and I chose not to show those because it's very hard to show masterpieces on stage and have someone discuss them as masterpieces when you never live up to that. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci wouldn't live up to that. So I put them outside, but there was always, everyone said you did it wrong, they should have been visible, or blah, blah, blah. It was, you know, I, I decorated my living room, but I don't say this is the best of me. I don't. It was I didn't agree with it dramaturgically, actually. I thought my designing on that one looked a little hokey, too. It looked a little circle rep oldie-timey. It got too literal. But it was an odd play. He's sort of Ibsenian in his writing, so things are very literal, yet they have this sort of huge metaphor, and it's very hard to find the right place. I sort of think he's better off with no scenery than something that illustrates what he's talking about.
D&D only. This was Circle Repertory, 1988.
Yeah, I was in repertory with another play.
Now what, the great-grandson of Jedediah? No, What the Butler Saw?
No, it was
No.
in
Florida Crackers?
Florida Crackers. Yeah, it took place in Florida. That was kind of fun to design. I learned on that one that real sand gets into the air conditioning system at the theater. The micro sand gets in. We broke the Circle Rep air conditioner, which in those days was serious because we didn't have much money.
And What the Butler Saw?
Yeah, that was in the series of Joe Wharton revivals that Joey Tillinger was doing. It was fun. It was good. Carol Shelley, Joe Mahar, wonderful cast.
Aristocrats.
Yeah, that was Brian Friel. I had done Faith Healer on Broadway. It was the second Broadway play after Philadelphia, Here I Come. I later did Philadelphia, Here I Come for the Roundabout with Joe Dowling directing. Yeah, Aristocrats. That was good. Again, Manhattan Theater Club. They don't make it easy. It was supposed to be in their main theater, but the play ahead of me extended, so they rented the theater 4, and was given, I think it was Easter weekend, to redesign it to go into theater 4. It was very awkward, but it turned out smelling like a rose. It looked very good there, and the play was quite well received. It was very interesting. It had a Anglo-Irish and American cast. It was very interesting seeing the different acting styles try to mesh, and I always thought it was fascinating. Niall Buggy was in it. He was a wonderful actor, but he had his role of the sloppy, they're very precise. He was Margaret Collin was a sloppy drunk, and he was very precise, and everything had to be just so in the script. And something went wrong on stage, and one of the chairs got flipped over in a very annoying way, and it had to be fixed. And he standing there talking about how picky he is and how fussy and everything has to be just so. His performance was in stone, and he wasn't about to go over to the chair and fix it. Margaret Collin, who was supposed to be a sloppy drunk, and they comment how she doesn't care about her appearance or anything else, finds a way to go over and flip the chair over to make it. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. He couldn't, within his character, he couldn't go there. But in her character, an American style, and the director, Robin, loved American actors and how physical they were in Circle Rep and all that. But then he turned to Kailani Jones and he turned to her and said, I can't understand why you're crying every night. And she said, well, I'm supposed to cry. My character is supposed to cry. He says, well, you'll be exhausted. It's so bad for you. And so they had this big discussion how she could just turn her back to the audience and pretend to cry. And this American actress did not understand that. And I thought it was so odd. He said he loved this tactile, realistic American acting, but he didn't really love it. He wouldn't have enjoyed Circle Rep, I don't think.
Elia Massaneri.
Yeah, that went to Spoleto Festival. Someone called it Spoleto and it stuck. Spoleto Festival. Lynn Meadow directed. That was fun.
Lee Blessing. Florida Crackers, which we talked about. Twelfth Night, or What You Will, at the Delacorte Theater. This was '89. Is this your first show at Delacorte?
Yes, I guess it was. Harold Guskin, the acting coach, directed it. I didn't realize they burned through a number of designers before they got to me. That's how I ended up designing it. Michelle Pfeiffer, star-studded cast, hugely star-studded cast. It was interesting watching Michelle Pfeiffer. You realize that stage acting and film acting are quite different. Like, her upper body would tell you one story, and the lower body she thought was out of sight, but it wasn't. So, like, she'd be nervous up here, and her feet would be relaxed at this. She wasn't a full body actress, and she would always turn to whoever was speaking to her, which you would do in a movie. But of course, the audience. Finally, Charlene Woodard was in it, and Charlene very sweetly just grabbed her and turned her around and said, "They want to see you." I knew Harold told me she was auditioning, and I knew as soon as he said that. He came back and said, "You won't believe it, but it's not that she's a movie star or anything, it's just that she was the best person who auditioned for it." And I'm like, there's nothing wrong with casting her because she's Michelle Pfeiffer, but it was, everybody pretended that it wasn't. It was hard to design for. He'd never really directed a play, I think. He was a very famous coach and all these actors got on board. It was wonderful who they got, but because he was such a wonderful coach and he made them feel very confident. But Joe tried to fire him and replace him with himself, and the actors refused. And so it was kind of awkward, and then it became a huge, of course, hit because everyone wanted to see all these people.
Titus Andronicus?
Well, and oddly, that one, which I was more excited to do, bombed. Michael Maggio, Frank Rich I'd done a lot of shows with Michael Maggio in Chicago with the Goodman. He's a wonderful guy, director. I think that was, Frank Rich said, "Oh, I told you to hire him, but not for this show." Frank Rich thought he ran the universe at that point. And Michael had a sort of sweet human side to him, not quite suited to Titus Andronicus. And the Shakespeare Festival was now in trouble financially at that point, and they were sort of in a rut, and they didn't have enough money to live up to their aspirations at that point. It was awkward. Later on, the shows in the park, I did more that it got worse, and then it got better. It didn't do very well during George C. Wolfe's period either. He would, unless it was his, he would under budget those shows as well. And then later on, now
George Wolfe.
George Wolfe,
Yeah.
later, George C. Wolfe.
Beside Herself.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was at Circle Rep.
89.
89. Bill Hurt returns to Circle Rep. He was having something in the tabloids going on about him. We had to smuggle him out of the theater in a hamper, put it in the back of a van, pretend it was a electrics delivery or something. There were some famous people in it. Was it Callista Flockhart? I don't even know. There were some really famous people in it. Became famous, besides Bill. Wonderful actor. Wonderful Circle Rep actor. Really. He was wonderful in 4th of July. Really. Really. It's interesting, to watch all these, because you'd see all these people so early, like Demi Moore, you see them so early in their career before they've even shown up in Hollywood or they've only briefly. It's so interesting to see what they become. But some of them are great stage actors to begin with.
Devil and Billy Markham, Lincoln Center, Mitzi Newhouse.
Yeah, that was Greg. It's really Oh Hell by David Mamet. It's in a twin bill. So directed by Gregory Mosher. That was a one-man curtain raiser, and then Oh Hell. It's a David Mamet play called Oh Hell. Mm-hmm. Interesting to return to David again. Gregory Mosher now directing. Interesting play. William Macy in it. really some magic tricks. Again, they hired a guy to do the magic, and thank God I'd done Penn and Teller, but some of it I just did myself with prop people. But he got all the credit, whatever.
Bad Habits? That was that
Terrence
Sid Center.
McNally, yeah, that was kind of that was an unfortunate experience. It was a revival. Terrence was now on a roll, and they wanted to revive that. But, it got a little off, and nobody was happy. It's too bad. Nathan was in it, and Nathan Lane and Terrence's muse by that point, and Faith Prince, and there was much unhappiness backstage.
I can remember the lady left, and Allison Janney went in.
Did she really?
Yes, and did the rest of the run because Allison was doing a play for me at that time.
And I had done something with Allison Janney way off Broadway about Lilith. My friend Bob Bailey directed it. I saw her recently. She's so nice. She came up to me and said, "Do you remember me?" And I'm saying, "Well, you're Allison Janney." She remembered that we weren't that far back. It was funny.
Prin.
Eileen Atkins, another British import. Sometimes Manhattan Theatre Club did one too many British imports, and it wasn't the greatest play. Eileen Atkins was very good in it, but wasn't really.
The Taming of the Shrew with Delacorte Theatre.
Oh, that was fun. Going back to The Woods by David Mamet, I'd done this set down at the Public, and it was all these old ropes that were supposed to be the woods, and everybody got all bent out of shape about it. There was one person who liked them, was A.J. Antoon, and I think he was a little high at the time, but he wandered through the ropes. He just thought it was great. And so we ended up doing Song of Singapore together, and we ended up doing Taming of the Shrew in Central Park. And I loved A.J., and that was done as a Wild West show with, it's like it started with tumbleweeds blowing down the street. And of course, being a Western guy, I was like the only person who knew what a tumbleweed actually looked like. We had them at our street. I used to grab them and tie them together and make snowmen or Christmas trees out of them, spray paint them and put Christmas lights on them. But getting someone in New York to understand what a tumbleweed did, and of course, AJ was kind of nuts and kind of wonderful, very wonderful, and he had a very wonderful, rich visual sense, and he really appreciated good visuals. There was some really fun. Helen Hunt was Bianca, and she had Tracy Ullman shooting out balloons around her head on a wooden wall that was painted like a Remington painting. It was like a movie street of Western facades. It was painted with this huge Remington poster, horses charging at you. It was fun, shooting out these balloons. And Tracy Ullman was great fun on stage, and she was with, sorry, I can't do names. Big black actor driving Miss Daisy, Morgan Freeman. He never learned it. I don't know, Tracy Ullman never broke, but he never learned it. He was used to the movies by then, and he wouldn't even take his script home at night sometimes. They got through it somehow, and it was delightful, but AJ was a great loss. I mean, he was, it's too bad. It was an AIDS-related thing.
The Sum of Us at Cherry Lane Theatre.
Yeah, that was an early gay play. Took place in Australia. Found it very hard to design because it was domestic, which is always hard. And I get hired to do a lot of domestic plays because I got typecast doing interiors. But very hard to do middle-class Australian. I don't know what. I've been in Australia, and I still couldn't tell you what to do to make it look like a middle-class Australian. It looks very much like Florida or something. I'm not sure everybody was happy with that one. It was sort of a dark period.
It had a good run down there, though. As I
Pretty good
recall.
run, yeah.
Commercial
Pretty good
venture.
run.
Yeah. Absent Friends at Manhattan Theater Club.
Nice set. I remember Pete Gurney liked that set. Another Alan Ayckbourn started. Gillian Anderson started in that play. We didn't know who she was. She was just out of Juilliard, I believe. Another Alan Ayckbourn, done fairly well. Brenda Blethyn, wonderful. Lynn had the strangest thing about, I don't know about women's clothing. Like, she's very particular about women's clothes on stage, and Jane Greenwood did the clothes very well, but something kept gnawing at her, and one day I came in and Brenda Blethyn had the same dress on in a totally different color, and I said, what happened? And Jane said, Lynn just... The final note was, oh yeah, I like it all. Wrong color. Cost a lot of money. Again, the theater club was a little chintzy on the money back then, and I came in and I had a sort of a meltdown one day about that, because I came in and they were picking pieces of... They told me they didn't have enough money to pay for the drapes on the set, so I bought them myself, and I came in one day and they were all deciding which pieces of the furnishers they would take home to their apartments, and I was like, I don't think you earned that. I paid for the drapes. You should...
The Substance of Fire.
And then the Victoria Bailey, who's now with TDF, right, or whatever she's with.
Yeah.
She came there. She was the general manager. She came through pissed off, and she said, "Oh, this set looks like $1 million," and she was pissed off. And the crew and I looked at each other. Well, we all know it didn't cost $1 million. It wasn't enough money. It looks like it cost $1 million. What's the problem? If it was on budget and it looks like $1 million, what's the problem? Manhattan Theater Club was very conservative financially. Always was, always will be. That's how they survived, right? Oh, I'm sorry.
The Substance of Fire.
Oh, interesting. There's a shotgun marriage that worked out. Andre Bishop, I finally show up with Playwrights Horizons after all this year living in a parallel universe. There were Circle Rep people, Manhattan Theater Club people, and there were Playwrights Horizons people. Jerry Gutierrez had been all those years. We designed a lot of things together, and then 10 years apart, and all of a sudden all this started coming back together again. But Andre Bishop had been following me all those years, and he asked me to do this John Robin Bates thing directed by Dan Sullivan, who had had great success with already on Broadway with the Heidi Chronicles and stuff. And I don't even know why Andre, I don't know why I was hired, but I went out, met with Dan Sullivan out in Seattle, and I'd known him briefly out in Seattle because I'd done something at the Rep, but I hadn't worked with him. He reminded me later that I had turned him down once years and years ago on a play, and I didn't remember it until later. It all came back. I remembered what he was wearing. But Substance of Fire, I went out to Seattle. I don't know how they could afford to send me there, and I got caught in a horrific once-in-a-century snowstorm. Dan ran to his house, leaving me. I had to design the show, so I climbed up the hill. It took me an hour, 2 hours, and I was finding on my hands and knees on the ice trying to get to his house. And I got there, and we kept designing. I guess it endeared me to him, but I was determined to get a set out of them because they paid for me to go to Seattle. So they had the Revolve, Playwrights Horizon had the Revolve left over from Assassins, and it stayed there for years. And every show I did at Playwrights then had that Revolve in it, so it was sort of, they were very, it was fascinating watching Dan Sullivan work on it. He's so good with text, and he's so precise. And the last scene didn't work, and he kept trying combinations of people turning light switches on and lighting postcards and sitting down this time and lighting this time light switch, and saying a line or two. And without changing the text, he somehow got it in the right order till it really worked. It was fascinating to watch him. He's very particular about technical things. It's almost always related to text, and fascinating. I mean, I've done a number of new plays with him. Sometimes, if it doesn't make sense to him, it goes badly. But he has to make sense of it, and if he can make sense of it, it really is fascinating to watch. I later did a couple Wendy Wasserstein plays with him, and fascinating to watch them work together, of course. One thing about being a designer that's great, I mentioned Neil Simon before. I'm not his greatest fan, but sometimes it's very interesting. We're designers are so zealot-like. I'm in the room with people. I was in the room with Arthur Miller. It's like they can't hide from you because you're doing a show and you're watching Neil Simon work and how his brain works, or Dan Sullivan, or Wendy, or Arthur Miller, or all these people, Harold Pinter. It's just fascinating. But you're sort of like the silent observer, like in the back row. No one even remembers that you're there. Or sometimes, you're in the middle of incipient romances that nobody noticed, Like, I was in the middle of, Natasha Richardson and Liam Neeson's explosion during Anna Christie. How could I help it? I was, on stage with them doing this and this. Interesting.
Mr. Gogol and Mr. Preen.
Well, talk about being a witness. Elaine May, who I'm a huge fan of, very interesting, very attractive woman. I found her so attractive. I was a huge fan, of course, of the Nichols and May routines. I can do lots of them myself, but the inimitable style. There was a little generational difference. I've often had generational differences. Early on, I'd be put in with people 2 generations ahead of me. The greatest was Miss LeGallion, who was, 45 years ahead of me. But watching Elaine, it never worked out, and she would rewrite and curiously, the poster, I was laughing, I'm working at Lincoln Center, the poster has these 2 men, they were vacuum cleaner salesmen. By the time the play opened, there was no vacuum cleaner, it's like odd. She kept going at it. I did another play verse later at Manhattan Theater Club. Big fan. Didn't get to know her that well, but
Song of Singapore.
That was with A.J. Antune. That was an interesting project. Donna Murphy shows up in our lives. We renovated the Irving Plaza, that rock venue, to basically a sort of Chinese quarter of Singapore nightclub restaurant. I later designed 54 Below, the nightclub for Richard Frankel and Partners and Ivy Boys. And that was the same group. It's funny, years later ending up serving food again, which is so hard to do. So much about that was about public accommodation, seating, serving poo-poo platters and fire doors. And I remember I was down on my hands and knees in the men's room gluing Chinese Lucky Charm symbols to the doors of the men's room. I'm thinking, why am I here? It was kind of fun, though. It was a fun evening. It almost worked. Again, AJ, it was fun. He is such appreciative of visual things. That it's one place where I found, hanging, I think I hung like 250 Chinese bird cages in the air, and people were so impressed. They were fairly inexpensive, but, once you get that many, it's impressive no matter what it is, right? Just to see so many, it's like, that's a lot of bird cages.
Lips together, teeth apart.
Oh, yes. Wow, you could write a whole book about that play. Lips together, teeth apart. It was designed by committee. No, actually the design was based on, I had a kabuki book kabuki design book that I liked a lot. It took place, well, when I first got the play, it took place not on Fire Island as it does now. It was on shore in Long Island. I think in the Hamptons or something. And he rewrote it. And I got a phone call from Joy saying, "Oh, it's on Fire Island." Fortunately, I had a friend, my dear friend Wayne, who I met from the theater club. He'd been the TD of the Manhattan Theater Club so long ago. Used to go to Fire Island. He always made me come out once a year, and I didn't really like Fire Island that much. But I'd go out, and thank God I'd just been there, so it was like good designer memory. It was hard to design. Terrence had so many requirements. There was you had to see 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a porch, a swimming pool, a tool shed, a bug zapper, a kite, wind chimes, working shower. I think there was a living room, and next door neighbors. It was a tall order. And I finally said, and this is where a designer helps on new plays. I finally said to Joey, "Have you noticed that the tool shed that he wants on stage to hide an important thing is only used in the first act and then never used again? So we're ending up with this elephant on stage that's never mentioned or touched again. Can't we cut that?" So he cut the one thing and he made it a toolbox that Nathan Lane brought out and opened. But so I had to do some serious organizing. It was hard, and the theater club interfered a lot, but maybe in a good way, I don't know. I did 3 designs, and they all picked one from one category. Anyhow, I finally took the kabuki thing and put it all together, and it came out quite well. Interestingly, Terrence had an obsession with Lanford Wilson and all the Talley family plays, and he came early to a meeting at my house, and I realized not by accident, he wanted to make sure that I didn't have any leafy greens on the set like I did on the Talley plays. I said, "Oh, no salad, right? You don't want any salad." And he was very serious. He didn't get my joke. But Oliver Smith, the designer, used to call that salad when you had the artificial greenery. And he was very... And I thought, oh, kabuki's great for that because they never have artificial greenery at all. So the set didn't ever have any artificial greenery. Something that he took away from my designing Talley plays that he just didn't want on his.
Oh,
interesting.
It's
but it went on and on. That was hard. That play was being rewritten. It wasn't, even today, those actors who were in that were so surprised when it was successful, and they were yeoman workers, really working hard, pulling that thing off. It was amazing. And Joey reminded me later that we went to a run-through and we all laughed and were enjoying it, and the actors were totally weirded out. They thought we were laughing at them or something. That they were so upset because they thought it was such a mess, and that wasn't. It actually pulled together, became something. But it was amazing what the process it took to go there. It was and working barbecues and working showers and deciding how much of Nathan's screwing up boards and seeing how much of Nathan you wanted to see in the shower, and the pH level of the pool that they had to get. I was just layers of work.
Was it always at the Lortel, or
no,
had it been someplace?
It was a Manhattan Theater Club, and then it was the last show of the season. It extended for a very long time, and then was so successful that they moved it to the Lortel, and then we also did it moved to the Mark Taper Forum as well. Very successful.
And it was when it was the Manhattan Theater Club. It was at City Center.
City Center.
Downstairs at City Center.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
The ceiling was still, I think the ceiling had been raised by then, but it was way too low to do. The design, it was supposed to be outdoors, and you can't get a light further away than 3 feet from the actor's head. It's so awkward trying to design something that gives the illusion of big sky when there's this oppressive ceiling.
The Substance of Fire, which was then moved to Lincoln Center.
Yeah, Andre did the thing you do when you move from one venue to another. He brought a few shows with him and some people that he'd worked with before, and he brought his hit up there and was equally successful at the Mitzi. A new design. I've designed Substance of Fire 3 times plus doing the movie, and each time a slightly different design. Oh, sometimes totally different design.
Empty Hearts.
Search me.
Okay, that was at Empty Hearts was at
Yeah,
Circle
the
Repertory
Circle
on
Yeah.
9th Avenue.
This is the
No.
play, Jennifer, and I can't remember.
Oh, okay.
Is it by John Bishop? No.
I'm not sure. We should probably